Hello, and welcome back to another evening of shared stories and, well, some genuinely strange coincidences. Tonight we're talking about something that has fascinated the internet for years now, and honestly, the deeper I went into researching this, the more my jaw just kept dropping. We're talking about The Simpsons and their seemingly impossible ability to predict the future. Now, if you've spent any amount of time online, you've probably seen the memes. You've seen the side-by-side screenshots. Someone posts a clip from a Simpsons episode that aired in 1997 next to a news headline from 2020, and the comments just explode with people saying the writers must be time travelers. And I get it. Some of these are genuinely eerie, but tonight I want to go deeper than just the memes. I want to walk through as many of these predictions as I can, give you the full context of the episodes they came from, explain what actually happened in real life, and try to figure out why a cartoon about a yellow family in a fictional American town keeps getting things right. Before we get into it though, I think it's worth setting the stage a little bit. The Simpsons premiered on December 17th, 1989. That's over 35 years ago. As of right now, the show has produced more than 800 episodes across 37 seasons, making it the longest-running American primetime scripted television series in history. It's also the longest-running animated show. It has won 37 Emmy Awards. It has been parodied, referenced, and quoted so many times that linguists have compared its cultural impact to Shakespeare and the Bible, which is a wild sentence to say about a show where the main character's catchphrase is just the word dough. But here's the thing that makes the prediction phenomenon make a little more sense when you think about it. 800 episodes is a lot of content. That's thousands and thousands of jokes, sight gags, background details, throwaway lines, and entire plot lines. The show has covered literally every aspect of American life. Politics, technology, sports, food, entertainment, science, crime, education, religion, you name it. And because the writers are constantly taking real trends and pushing them to absurd conclusions for comedy, sometimes reality just catches up to the joke. Al Jean, who has been the showrunner for most of the show's run, put it pretty simply in an interview. He said if you throw enough darts, you're going to get some bullseyes. And producer Bill Oakley said something similar. He said there are very few cases where The Simpsons actually predicted something, and that it's mainly just coincidence because the episodes are so old that history ends up repeating itself. And honestly, I think that's mostly true. But, and this is a big but, some of these are so weirdly specific that even the "it's just math" explanation starts to feel insufficient. So tonight we're going to go through the ones that really stand out. Some are jaw-dropping, some are funny, some are a stretch, and I'll be honest about which ones I think are reaches. But all of them are worth talking about. There's a lot to cover, so get comfortable, maybe grab a drink or a snack, and let's get into it. If you enjoy what I do here and want a way to support the channel, consider subscribing down below. But for now, settle in. This is going to be a long one. Let's start with the big ones. The predictions that made international headlines and turned Simpsons predicted it into basically a meme genre of its own. And there's really only one place to start. On March 19th in the year 2000, Fox aired an episode of The Simpsons called Bart to the Future. It was season 11, episode 17. The premise is pretty straightforward. Bart gets shown a vision of what his life will look like as an adult, and it's not great. He's a 40-year-old failed musician living in a beachside cabin with Ralph Wiggum, of all people, barely making rent and mooching off everyone he knows. But the real interesting part of the episode isn't about Bart at all. It's about Lisa. In this future, Lisa Simpson has become the President of the United States. And not just any president, the show specifically calls her America's first heterosexual female president, which is a joke in itself because it implies things about the presidents who came before her. But the line that would become one of the most famous in television history comes during a cabinet meeting. Lisa is sitting in the Oval Office with her advisors, and she says, and I'm paraphrasing here, that they've inherited quite the budget crunch from President Trump. President Trump, said on television in the year 2000, 16 years before Donald Trump actually won the presidency in 2016. Now, when this episode aired, it wasn't completely out of nowhere. Trump had actually started making noise about running for president around that time. In 1999, he formed an exploratory committee to run for the Reform Party nomination. He ended up not going through with it, but the idea of Trump as president was floating around enough that the Simpsons writers thought it would make for a funny gag. Dan Graney, who wrote the episode, later explained to The Hollywood Reporter that they chose Trump because he represented the idea of a celebrity politician taken to its most absurd extreme. The whole point of the joke was that Lisa would have to clean up the mess left behind by the most ridiculous president imaginable. The thing is, the writers assumed that was the joke, that it was so outlandish, so obviously absurd that it would just be funny and nothing more. Nobody expected it to actually happen. And then 2016 rolled around and the internet basically exploded. Screenshots from the episode went viral. People dug up the clip and it racked up millions of views. The Simpsons had called it, not vaguely, not sort of, but specifically, President Trump. And when Trump won again in 2024, the whole thing came back around a second time. But it actually gets weirder. In the same episode, when we see Lisa as president, she's wearing a very specific outfit. It's a purple pantsuit with a strand of pearls. Now, pearls are Lisa's thing. She always wears them, so that part isn't surprising. But the purple pantsuit caught people's attention years later when Kamala Harris wore a strikingly similar outfit, a purple pantsuit with pearls, to the 2021 presidential inauguration when she was sworn in as vice president. Mike Scully, one of the longtime Simpsons writers, was asked about this, and he said the pantsuit was probably a nod to Hillary Clinton at the time, since pantsuits were kind of her signature look, or they were just going for a generic power look for Lisa. And the color purple? Scully said that seemed to have been a random choice, probably made by the animators rather than the writers. So the Lisa and Kamala thing might genuinely be a coincidence. But laid on top of the Trump prediction, it just adds to this feeling that the episode was seeing something the rest of us couldn't. There's actually a fun little layer to this whole thing that I found while researching. In season 34, which aired in 2022, the show did a meta bit where a time-traveling adult, Bart, appears in the original 1989 Christmas episode and starts listing off predictions from the future. He mentions Trump becoming president, pandemics, gas hoarding, Germany beating Brazil 7-1 in the 2014 World Cup, and Disney buying Fox. The show is completely aware of its reputation at this point, and they're having fun with it. I think that's kind of great. They've been accused of being prophets for so long that they've just leaned into it as a bit. Now, while we're on the topic of politics and major world events, I need to talk about the pandemic one because it's probably the prediction that hit closest to home for a lot of people. In 1993, season 4 of The Simpsons aired an episode called Marge in Chains. The plot starts with Homer watching an infomercial late at night and ordering a juice machine. Simple enough. But then the show cuts to the factory in Osaka, Japan, where the juicers are being packaged. One of the workers is visibly sick. He's coughing and sneezing, and his germs get into the box as it's being sealed up. The product's shipped to Springfield, and before long, the entire town is hit with an epidemic that the media in the show dubs the Osaka flu. Now let's fast forward to early 2020. COVID-19, which originated in Wuhan, China, began spreading worldwide and eventually caused a global pandemic that changed pretty much everything about how the world works. The parallels are uncomfortable. Both the fictional and real outbreaks originated in East Asia. Both spread through international commerce and travel. Both caused widespread panic and social disruption. The Simpsons version was played for laughs, obviously, with Homer being Homer and Springfield overreacting in the most Springfield way possible. But the broad strokes are unsettling when you line them up. And here's the thing, it doesn't stop there. In the same episode, after the Osaka flu hits Springfield, a swarm of killer bees descends on the town. That detail went largely unnoticed until 2020 when, just a couple months into the pandemic, Asian giant hornets, which the media immediately dubbed murder hornets, started making headlines in the Pacific Northwest. So you've got a pandemic from Asia followed by killer insects in the same episode, mirroring real events that happened almost in sequence. There's even a third layer. In Marge in Chains, Mayor Quimby goes on vacation during the crisis, essentially abandoning Springfield in his time of need. In February 2021, Senator Ted Cruz flew to Cancun, Mexico, while his home state of Texas was in the middle of a devastating winter storm that knocked out power for millions of people. I wouldn't call that a direct prediction necessarily, but politicians vacationing during disasters is apparently something the Simpsons writers understood as a universal truth about public officials 28 years before it made national news. It's worth being honest here, though. The Osaka flu was a flu, not a coronavirus. It spread through a juicer, not through respiratory droplets. And the show was riffing on the idea of cheap, overseas manufacturing spreading disease, which was already a cultural anxiety in the early 90s. The writers weren't predicting COVID specifically. They were making a joke about globalization and public health panic. But the visual of a virus spreading from a factory in Asia to a small American town, causing mass hysteria, is hard to ignore when you look at it with 20/20 eyes. Let's move to another big one. This one is less scary and more just kind of funny in hindsight. In 1998, The Simpsons aired an episode called When You Dish Upon a Star. It's Season 10, Episode 5. The plot involves Homer going to Hollywood and befriending some celebrities, including Alec Baldwin, Kim Basinger, and Ron Howard. At one point, Ron Howard takes a screenplay that Homer wrote and brings it to the 20th Century Fox studio lot to pitch it. And here's the moment. There's an establishing shot of the Fox studio, and right there on the sign, underneath the 20th Century Fox logo, it reads, "A division of Walt Disney Company." In 1998, that was a joke. Fox and Disney were competitors. The idea that Disney would own Fox was absurd, like saying Burger King would buy McDonald's. But then in December 2017, Disney reached a deal to acquire 21st Century Fox's entertainment assets for roughly $71 billion. The deal was finalized in 2019. And just like that, The Simpsons, a Fox show, became Disney property. The show literally predicted its own change of ownership 20 years in advance. There's a beautiful irony in this one that I don't think gets talked about enough. The Simpsons didn't just predict that Disney would buy Fox. The Simpsons became part of the proof. The show moved to Disney Plus when that platform launched in November 2019, and it's now one of the most watched titles on the service. Disney announced in late 2025 that The Simpsons had surpassed 1 billion hours streamed on Disney Plus during that year alone. 1 billion hours. That's the equivalent of every person in Canada watching The Simpsons for roughly 26 hours straight. It's an almost incomprehensible amount of viewing. And think about what that means for the prediction itself. The joke from 1998 wasn't just correct. It was profitable. The Simpsons went from a Fox show to a Disney cash cow. The writers in 1998 were making a joke about corporate consolidation. And 21 years later, that consolidation made their show more valuable and more widely viewed than ever before. So the joke became reality, and then the joke became the thing making reality profitable. It's almost too perfect. Now, let's talk about surveillance. This one comes from the Simpsons movie, which came out in 2007. There's a scene where the Simpson family is on the run from the government, and Marge says something along the lines of, "It's not like the government is listening to everybody's conversation." And then the movie immediately cuts to the NSA, the National Security Agency, where rows and rows of employees are sitting at desks with headphones on, literally listening to everybody's conversations. It's played for laughs, this idea that government surveillance is everywhere and that anyone who says otherwise is naive. 6 years later, in 2013, a former NSA contractor named Edward Snowden leaked classified documents that revealed the NSA was indeed conducting mass surveillance programs on American citizens. The agency had been collecting phone records, internet activity, and all sorts of communications data on a massive scale. It was one of the biggest intelligence scandals in modern American history. Now, the idea that the government might be spying on its citizens wasn't exactly a wild theory even before the Simpsons movie. It had been a staple of conspiracy culture for decades. But the way the movie depicted it, with that matter-of-fact cut from Marge's dismissal to the massive surveillance operation, turned out to be remarkably close to what Snowden revealed. And there were earlier Simpsons episodes that played with the same idea. In one episode, you can see Homer's phone line labeled with tags for the FBI, CIA, and NSA, as if all three agencies were tapped in simultaneously. While we're still in the territory of major world events, there's one more I want to touch on before we shift gears. In 1997, Season 9 of The Simpsons aired an episode called Lisa's Sax. It's a flashback episode exploring how Lisa got her saxophone, and there's a brief moment where Marge is trying to cheer up a sick Bart by offering him something to read. She holds up a book titled Curious George and the Ebola Virus. At the time, Ebola was a real virus, but it wasn't widely known to most Americans. It had caused some outbreaks in Africa, but it wasn't the kind of thing that dominated the news cycle. The writers used it as a joke, the absurdity of combining a children's book character with a deadly virus. But then in 2014 and 2015, Ebola had its largest outbreak on record, killing over 11,000 people in West Africa and making headlines worldwide. Suddenly, that throwaway joke from 1997 looked a lot less funny and a lot more prescient. I should be clear, though, the writers weren't predicting a specific Ebola outbreak. Ebola had been discovered in 1976 and was known within the scientific community. The joke worked precisely because the virus sounded scary and exotic, but the timing of it resurfacing in such a devastating way nearly 2 decades after the episode aired is the kind of coincidence that fuels the whole Simpsons predicted it phenomenon. There's another world events prediction that's a bit more niche, but I think is really interesting. In January 2012, Season 23 aired an episode called Politically Inept with Homer Simpson. In the episode, Homer becomes a guest commentator on a cable news show called Head Butt. While he's on air, a news ticker scrolls across the bottom of the screen. Most people wouldn't even notice it, but if you pause at the right moment, one of the ticker items reads, "Europe puts Greece on eBay." 3 years later, in 2015, Greece became the first developed country in history to default on an International Monetary Fund loan. The country's economy was in absolute freefall. European creditors were demanding severe austerity measures, citizens were rioting, and there were serious conversations about whether Greece should remain in the European Union at all. The situation was so dire that it genuinely felt, at least metaphorically, like Europe might want to put Greece on eBay. The writers were obviously exaggerating for comedy. Greece had been struggling financially since 2009, so the joke was already rooted in real-world anxiety. But the fact that the crisis escalated to the point where the joke felt more like commentary than comedy is a pretty good example of how The Simpsons operates. They take something that's already happening and crank it up to 11, and sometimes the real world cranks itself up to match. All right, I want to pivot now and talk about a completely different category of predictions, because this is where things start getting really fun. We've covered politics and global events, the heavy stuff. Now let's talk about technology, because The Simpsons has called an almost absurd number of technological developments years and sometimes decades before they actually happened. And I want to start with probably the most visually striking one, and it comes from what might be the single most prophetic episode the show has ever produced. Lisa's Wedding, Season 6, Episode 19. It aired on March 19th, 1995, and the story takes place in what was then the distant future of 2010. The setup is that Lisa visits a Renaissance fair and meets a fortune teller who shows her what her life will look like 15 years from now. She's at a university in England. She falls in love with a British guy named Hugh Parkfield, voiced by Mandy Patinkin, and they plan to get married. The plot itself is charming and actually kind of bittersweet because the wedding doesn't end up happening. But the plot isn't why this episode is famous now. What makes Lisa's Wedding legendary is the background details, the throwaway gags, the little things the animators and writers included to make the year 2010 feel futuristic. Let's start with the smartwatch. During the episode, Hugh Parkfield is seen talking into his wristwatch. Not a phone, not a walkie-talkie, his watch. He holds it up to his face and has a full conversation through it. In 1995, this was science fiction. Sure, Dick Tracy had a wrist communicator back in the 1940s comic strips, and shows like Knight Rider and Star Trek had similar ideas. The concept wasn't brand new, but what makes the Simpsons version notable is how closely it resembles what actually came to market. Apple released the Apple Watch on April 24th, 2015, 20 years after the episode aired and 5 years after the fictional events of the episode took place. And if you look at a screenshot of Hugh talking into his wrist next to someone using an Apple Watch, the resemblance is genuinely striking. It's not some clunky sci-fi gadget with blinking lights. It looks like a modern smartwatch. Rectangular face, worn on the wrist, used for communication. The Simpsons writers may have been pulling from existing sci-fi tropes, but they nailed the form factor in a way that feels less like prediction and more like product design consultation. But the smartwatch isn't even the most impressive tech prediction from that same episode. In another scene, Lisa and Marge are talking, and they're doing it through video phones. Not audio only, but actual video calls where they can see each other on screen. Lisa even reminds Marge at one point that she's on a picture phone, so Marge should stop crossing her fingers while making promises because Lisa can actually see her doing it. It's a sweet little character moment, but it also happens to predict video calling as a mainstream technology. Now here's the thing that really gets me. The episode is set in 2010. Apple launched FaceTime on June 24th, 2010. The Simpsons didn't just predict video calling, they predicted the approximate year it would become a normal part of everyday life. And yes, video conferencing existed before 2010 in various forms. Skype launched in 2003. But FaceTime was the moment it became truly mainstream, built into the phone that everyone already had. The Simpsons nailed both the technology and the timeline. That same episode also has some smaller predictions that are worth mentioning. There's a concert poster in the background advertising the Rolling Stones Steel Wheelchair Tour 2010. The joke being that the Stones would still be touring in 2010, but they'd be so old they'd need wheelchairs. As it turned out, the Rolling Stones were indeed still touring in 2010. They're still touring now, actually. Mick Jagger is in his 80s and still performing. No wheelchairs yet, but give it time. And then there's a building that appears in the London skyline during an establishing shot. It's a tall, pointed, triangular skyscraper that doesn't match any building that existed in London in 1995. But when the Shard was completed in 2012, people noticed it bore a remarkable resemblance to that mystery building in the cartoon. The Shard sits in roughly the same position relative to Big Ben as the building in the episode, and the silhouette is strikingly similar. The writers probably just drew a generic futuristic skyscraper to make London look more advanced. But the fact that London went and built something that looks like it was pulled straight from the episode is another one of those coincidences that makes you do a double take. Okay, moving on to a prediction that's technically less flashy than smartwatches and video phones, but in some ways is even more impressive because it actually influenced real-world product development. And that's the autocorrect one. In 1994, Season 6 aired an episode called Lisa on Ice. There's a scene where Dolph, one of the school bullies, is using a device called the Apple Newton. This was a real product, by the way. Apple released the Newton Message Pad in 1993. It was one of the earliest personal digital assistants, kind of a precursor to the Palm Pilot and eventually the smartphone. One of its headline features was handwriting recognition. You could write on the screen with a stylus, and it would convert your handwriting into typed text. The problem was that it was terrible at this. Absolutely terrible. So in the episode, Dolph writes, "Beat up Martin" on his Newton, and the device helpfully autocorrects it to "Eat up Martha." It was a joke about how bad the Newton's handwriting recognition was. Simple and funny, but here's where it gets interesting. When Apple was developing the iPhone in the mid-2000s, they knew that text input was going to be one of the most important features. People were going to be typing on a tiny glass screen with their thumbs, and if the autocorrect wasn't good, the whole product would fail. According to Nitin Ganatra, who was a founding member of the iPhone software group, the team internally referred to the challenge of getting autocorrect right as the "Eat Up Martha" problem. They literally used the Simpsons gag as shorthand for what they needed to avoid. Ganatra said something like, "We needed to make sure the text input works on this thing, otherwise here comes the "Eat Up Marthas." So not only did the Simpsons predict that autocorrect would become a universal frustration in the smartphone era, but the joke was so perfectly on point that the people building the technology used it as a cautionary reference. That's a prediction that transcends coincidence. That's a cartoon joke becoming part of the development history of one of the most important products of the 21st century. I don't know about you, but I think that's incredible. And speaking of incredible, we need to talk about the Higgs boson. because this one is so nerdy and so specific that it makes you wonder what's going on in that writer's room. In 1998, Season 10 aired an episode called The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace. The plot is that Homer decides he wants to be like Thomas Edison and become a great inventor. It's a classic Homer episode. He's wildly overconfident, completely out of his depth, and yet somehow bumbles his way into moments of accidental brilliance. During the episode, there's a scene where Homer is standing in front of a blackboard and he's written out a complicated equation. There's also a diagram of a donut that's progressively being eaten because it's Homer, but the equation itself is the important part. You might assume it's just random numbers and symbols, squiggly lines that look mathish but don't actually mean anything. But that's not what happened here. Dr. Simon Singh, a physicist and the author of a book called The Simpsons and Their Mathematical Secrets, analyzed the equation and found something remarkable. The equation Homer wrote on that blackboard actually comes very close to predicting the mass of the Higgs boson particle. The Higgs boson, sometimes called the God particle, is a fundamental particle in physics. Its existence was first theorized in the 1960s by physicist Peter Higgs and several colleagues, but it wasn't actually detected and confirmed until 2012 when scientists at CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, announced they'd found it using the Large Hadron Collider. It was one of the biggest scientific discoveries of the century, and Homer Simpson had basically written the answer on a chalkboard 14 years earlier. Now, before you start thinking Homer is secretly a genius, there's a reason this happened, and it actually makes the whole thing more impressive, not less. The Simpsons writing staff is famously packed with highly educated people. We're talking about graduates from Harvard, people with degrees in mathematics, physics, and computer science. The Harvard Lampoon, which is Harvard's comedy magazine, has been a direct pipeline to the Simpsons writers' room for decades. Al Jean, the longtime showrunner, entered Harvard at 16 to study mathematics. Jeff Westbrook has a PhD in computer science from Princeton. Ken Keeler has a PhD in applied mathematics. David X. Cohen, who would later co-create Futurama with Matt Groening, has a degree in physics from Harvard. Cohen is actually the person most likely responsible for the Higgs boson equation. According to reports, he consulted a physicist friend to come up with an equation for Homer's blackboard that would be both scientifically plausible and amusing for anyone who happened to understand the math. They crafted an equation using known physical parameters at the time, essentially making a very sophisticated joke for the handful of viewers who would pause the episode and actually try to work it out. As Simon Singh explained, if you work it out, you get the mass of a Higgs boson that's only a bit larger than the nanomass of a Higgs boson actually is. It wasn't a lucky guess. It was an incredibly educated one. An inside joke for the scientifically literate that turned out to be nearly prophetic. I think this is one of the most important things to understand about the Simpsons prediction phenomenon. The writers aren't random people throwing spaghetti at the wall. They're some of the most intelligent comedy writers in the industry, people who read voraciously, follow current events obsessively, and have the academic background to extrapolate trends with a level of sophistication that goes way beyond what you'd expect from a cartoon. That's a big part of why the predictions feel so specific, because they often are specific, just couched in humor. Let's stay in the technology lane for a little while longer because there are a few more good ones here. In 1998, Season 9 aired an episode called Bart Carney. The plot involves the Simpson family dealing with carnival workers, but the detail that people latched onto years later is a carnival game that the citizens of Springfield are playing called Yard Work Simulator, and it's exactly what it sounds like. People are wearing what look like virtual reality headsets, hooked up to gardening tools and a computer, and they're pretending to do yard work. Mowing lawns, trimming hedges, the whole thing. And other people are watching and waiting for their turn. In 1998, this was comedy gold because it was so absurd. Who would want to simulate yard work? But then in 2009, a little game called Farmville launched on Facebook and became one of the biggest gaming phenomena in history. Tens of millions of people were logging on every day to virtually tend crops, feed animals, and maintain a farm. Farmville wasn't exactly yard work, but the core concept of a virtual simulation where people obsessively manage a property, The Simpsons had that nailed 11 years early. and it goes even further than Farmville. The virtual reality headsets that the Springfield citizens were wearing in that 1998 episode look a lot like what eventually became the Oculus Rift and other VR headsets that started hitting the consumer market in the 2000s. The idea of VR gaming wasn't new in 1998. There had been failed VR products in the early 90s, but the specific visual of regular people casually using VR to do mundane tasks was ahead of its time. There's also the baby translator, which I find genuinely charming. In 1992, Season 3 aired an episode called Brother, Can You Spare 2 Dimes? In it, Homer's half-brother Herb Powell, who's a brilliant inventor fallen on hard times, creates a device that can translate a baby's cries into English. The family puts it on Maggie, and suddenly they can understand what she's trying to say. It's a sweet comedic moment. 21 years later, in 2013, an app called Cry Translator was released. It claimed to be able to analyze a baby's cry and determine whether the baby was hungry, tired, uncomfortable, bored, or stressed. Was it as sophisticated as Herb's invention? No. Did it work all that well? From what I've read, reviews were mixed at best. But the concept of using technology to decode what a baby is communicating through its cries went from cartoon gag to actual product in just over 2 decades. And since then, several other apps and AI-based tools have tried to tackle the same problem with varying degrees of success. While we're talking about devices, there's a smaller one that I think is worth mentioning. In 1996, Season 8 aired Bart After Dark. There's a scene that features some kind of high-tech intercom or communication device, and if you look at it closely, it bears a striking resemblance to what would eventually become the first-generation iPod. The rectangular shape, the circular control wheel, the general proportions, it all lines up pretty well. Apple released the iPod in October 2001, 5 years after the episode aired. Now, is this a genuine prediction? I'm not sure. It could be coincidence. The design language of small electronic devices in the late 90s was already trending in that direction. But it's one of those visual similarities that's hard to unsee once someone points it out to you. There's one more technology prediction I want to cover in this section, and it's one that I think combines the political and the technological in a really interesting way. In 2008, for the Treehouse of Horror 19th special, which was season 20, episode 4, there's a segment where Homer goes to vote in the presidential election. He steps up to an electronic voting machine and tries to cast his vote for Barack Obama. But every time he presses Obama's name, the machine registers his vote for John McCain instead. Homer gets increasingly frustrated, jabbing at the screen over and over, but the machine just keeps switching his vote. Eventually, the machine eats him because it's a Treehouse of Horror episode and things have to get weird. 4 years later, during the 2012 presidential election, an electronic voting machine in Pennsylvania had to be taken out of service after a video went viral showing it doing exactly what the Simpsons machine had done. A voter was trying to select Barack Obama, and the machine kept registering the vote for Mitt Romney instead. The machine was removed and examined, and election officials said it was a calibration error. But the visual of someone pressing one candidate's name and watching the machine choose a different one was pulled straight from the cartoon. I find this one interesting because it's less about predicting a specific event and more about predicting a systemic problem. Electronic voting machines were relatively new in 2008, and there were already concerns about their reliability and security. Computer scientists have been warning for years that these machines were vulnerable to bugs, calibration errors, and potentially even deliberate tampering. The Government Accountability Office had published reports highlighting security concerns, but most of the public wasn't paying attention. The Simpsons took those wonky technical concerns that were buried in government reports and academic papers and made them visceral and relatable. Homer pressing a button and watching the machine betray him isn't a white paper about electoral security vulnerabilities. It's a gut-level experience that any viewer can understand and feel frustrated by. And when the exact same thing happened on camera 4 years later, the episode didn't just feel prophetic. It felt like a warning that nobody had heeded. This is actually one of the things The Simpsons does best, and it's a huge part of why the predictions land so hard. The show takes complex, systemic issues that most people find boring or abstract. things like voting machine security or NSA surveillance or food supply chain integrity and translates them into simple, human, emotionally resonant stories. Homer pressing a button and getting the wrong result is a story anyone can understand. And when that story turns out to be true, it hits differently than a government report saying the same thing. And actually, you know what? There's a related technology prediction that I want to squeeze in here because it's too good to skip. In the Simpsons movie, which came out in 2007, there's a scene where the NSA surveillance operation I mentioned earlier is in full swing. Workers are monitoring conversations, tracking people's movements, all of that. But there's a specific visual of someone at a computer being able to pinpoint a person's exact location in real time. It's basically Google Earth combined with real-time GPS tracking presented as a government surveillance tool. When the movie came out, that level of tracking felt exaggerated. But today, with the combination of cell phone, GPS data, social media check-ins, license plate readers, and the kind of capabilities that Snowden's leaks revealed, the idea that the government, or honestly even private companies, could track an individual's location in real time is not remotely science fiction anymore. It's Tuesday. All right, I think that covers the major technology predictions pretty well. Some of these are genuine calls, like the autocorrect one that literally influenced Apple's development process. Some are educated extrapolations by very smart writers, like the Higgs boson. And some are visual coincidences that might just be the natural evolution of design trends, like the iPod thing. But taken together, they paint a picture of a show that's not just funny, but deeply plugged into the trajectory of how the world is changing. The writers understand technology, they understand human behavior, and they understand that if you combine the two and push them to their logical extreme, you often end up somewhere pretty close to the future. Now, I want to shift gears again and talk about something that's a little lighter, a little more fun, and honestly pretty impressive even if you don't care about politics or physics. Let's talk about sports, because The Simpsons has called some genuinely wild sporting events, and one of them might be the most statistically improbable prediction the show has ever made. It starts in 1992 with an episode called Lisa the Greek, Season 3, Episode 14. The plot is about Homer and Lisa bonding over football. Homer discovers that Lisa has a knack for predicting the outcomes of football games, and he starts using her picks to win bets. It's a sweet father-daughter story with the usual Simpsons twist of Homer being kinda terrible about it. But here's the thing. The episode aired on January 23rd, 1992, just a few days before Super Bowl 26. In the episode, Lisa predicts that the Washington Redskins will win the big game. And sure enough, a few days later, the Washington Redskins beat the Buffalo Bills 37-24 to win the Super Bowl. Lisa called it. Now, that on its own is a fun coincidence. Getting a Super Bowl prediction right is a coin flip, essentially, especially when there are only two teams left. The odds are 50-50, but here's where it gets ridiculous. The following year, the writers decided to have some fun. They redubbed the dialogue in the episode for the rerun, changing the prediction so that Lisa picked the Dallas Cowboys. Super Bowl 27. The Dallas Cowboys beat the Buffalo Bills, who were back again 52-17. Lisa was right again. So the writers, now feeling pretty confident apparently, did it a third time. They redubbed the episode again for the next year's rerun, this time having Lisa predict the San Francisco 49ers. Super Bowl 29. The 49ers won, beating the San Diego Chargers 49-26, 3 years in a row. Lisa Simpson called the Super Bowl winner 3 consecutive times. Now, the odds of getting 3 coin flips right in a row are 1 in 8. Not astronomical by any means. But the way the writers leaned into it, redubbing the same episode each year like they were running some kind of experiment, makes it genuinely funny. And from what I've read, they stopped after 3 because they either didn't want to push their luck or the joke had run its course. Smart move, honestly. Quit while you're ahead. There's also a fun little connection to Lady Gaga's Super Bowl halftime show that I'll get to a bit later, but the point is that The Simpsons and the Super Bowl have a surprisingly intertwined history for a show about a cartoon family. Moving on to what might be the most satisfying sports prediction the show has made. In February 2010, Season 21 aired an episode called Boy Meets Curl. The plot is that Homer and Marge, of all people, take up curling and end up representing the United States in the Winter Olympics. Through a series of absurd events, because it's The Simpsons, they end up in the gold medal match against Sweden, and they win. The United States defeats Sweden for the gold medal in curling. At the time, this was played entirely for laughs. The United States was not a curling powerhouse. They'd never won gold in the sport. The idea of Americans beating Sweden, which is one of the traditional curling powers, was the whole joke. It was absurd because it would never happen, except it did. 8 years later, at the 2018 Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, South Korea, the US, men's curling team pulled off one of the biggest upsets in Olympic history. They defeated Sweden in the gold medal match, winning their first ever Olympic gold in the sport. The parallels were so obvious that the story went viral almost immediately. The Simpsons predicted it trended on social media. Even some of the curling team members referenced the episode in interviews. I think what makes this one so satisfying is that curling is such a specific and relatively niche sport. If The Simpsons had predicted that the US would win gold in swimming or track, no one would blink. Those are sports where the US wins medals regularly. But curling? Against Sweden? In the gold medal match? That's the kind of specificity that makes you genuinely wonder. While we're on the topic of international sports, there's a really good one from 2014 that involves the most beautiful game. Season 25 aired an episode called You Don't Have to Live Like a Referee. The plot follows Homer as he's recruited to referee international football matches, or soccer if you're American, because the global football organization needs someone with integrity to clean up their image. During the episode, the representative from this unnamed football federation is arrested on corruption charges. Homer himself gets handcuffed and dragged off the field. The episode also correctly depicted Germany defeating Brazil in that year's World Cup. If you remember the 2014 World Cup, you probably remember the semi-final match between Germany and Brazil because it was one of the most shocking results in football history. Germany absolutely demolished Brazil 7-1 on Brazil's home soil. It was humiliating. Grown men in the stands were weeping. Children were crying. The Brazilian players looked like they'd been hit by a bus. Commentators were stunned into silence. It became one of the most memed sporting events in internet history, spawning thousands of jokes and reaction videos. And The Simpsons had predicted Germany winning that tournament, which by itself is noteworthy. But the corruption part is what really stood out a year later. In May 2015, the FBI indicted 14 people connected to FIFA, the actual governing body of world football, on charges including bribery, fraud, and money laundering. 7 FIFA officials were arrested in a dramatic early morning raid at a luxury hotel in Zurich, Switzerland. The scandal led to the resignation of FIFA president Sepp Blatter and triggered massive reforms within the organization. The Simpsons episode had aired just 1 year before the arrests. An episode about corruption in a global football organization where an official gets arrested, followed by the biggest corruption scandal in the sport's history. The timing is almost uncomfortably close. And then there's the Siegfried and Roy one, which is a prediction that I think most people have heard about, but which is worth covering because the details are pretty specific. In 1993, Season 5 aired Springfield, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Legalized Gambling. Springfield legalizes gambling, and Mr. Burns opens a casino. Among the entertainment acts is a duo of flamboyant German magicians performing with a white tiger. The parody characters are called Gunther and Ernst, which is a pretty obvious send-up of Siegfried and Roy, who were the most famous magic act in Las Vegas at the time. During their performance in the episode, the white tiger attacks them. 10 years later, in October 2003, the real Roy Horn was attacked by one of their white tigers, Montecore, during a live performance at the Mirage Hotel in Las Vegas. Roy suffered severe injuries, including a severed spine and partial paralysis. He survived but never performed again, and he passed away in 2020. Now, I should note that animal rights activists and people who study captive animal behavior had been warning for years that performing with big cats was inherently dangerous. The Simpsons writers weren't making a prediction so much as they were making a joke that acknowledged an obvious risk. Working with wild animals, especially large predators, is dangerous. It was always a matter of when, not if. But the visual of two magicians being attacked by their own white tiger, depicted 10 years before it actually happened, is one of those Simpsons moments that sticks with people. All right, let's shift from sports to business and corporate predictions, because The Simpsons has called some genuinely surprising things in the world of commerce, industry, and consumer culture. One of my favorites is the horse meat scandal. In 1994, Season 5 aired Sweet Seymour Skinner's Badass song. There's a scene in the Springfield Elementary cafeteria where lunch lady Doris is preparing food for the students, and she's scooping meat out of a barrel that's labeled Assorted Horse Parts, with the delightful subtitle, Now with More Testicles. It's a gross-out gag about the quality of school lunches, and at the time it was just a funny background detail. But in 2013, a massive food scandal erupted across Europe. Investigations in France, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and several other countries revealed that beef products, things like frozen hamburgers and ready meals sold in major supermarkets, contained horse meat that was not listed on the packaging. People had been eating horse without knowing it. The scandal led to product recalls, criminal investigations, and a major crisis of confidence in the European food supply chain. The Simpsons had depicted horse meat being secretly fed to an unsuspecting population 19 years before it actually happened. Granted, the show was joking about school cafeteria food being awful, which is a universal experience. But the specific detail of horse meat being disguised and served to people who had no idea what they were eating is remarkably close to what actually went down. Another corporate prediction that feels eerily prescient is the decline of JCPenney. In Season 18, which aired in 2007, there's an episode called Please Homer, Don't Hammer 'Em. The opening sequence shows the Simpson family walking through a dilapidated shopping mall, and Marge passes by an abandoned storefront and says something like, "Oh, a JCPenney's used to be here." The store is gone. The mall is dying. It's played as a quick gag about the state of American retail. 13 years later, in May 2020, JCPenney filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy during the COVID-19 pandemic. The company had been struggling for years, closing stores and hemorrhaging money, but the pandemic delivered the final blow. JCPenney didn't quite spiral to the level of the dead mall in the episode, but the trajectory was right. A once iconic American department store that everyone assumed would always be there, slowly fading away. The broader prediction here isn't really about JCPenney specifically. It's about the death of the American shopping mall and the decline of department stores, which The Simpsons captured in 2007 and which has been playing out in real time ever since. Sears went bankrupt in 2018. Macy's has been closing stores. The trend of anchor department stores disappearing from malls and taking the smaller shops down with them is something that economists and retail analysts have been tracking for over a decade. But The Simpsons boiled it down to one quick visual gag and moved on. Now here's one that I find particularly wild because it involves a fan of the show actually making a fictional creation real. In 1999, Season 11 aired E-I-E-I-Do. Homer moves the family to a farm and, in classic Homer fashion, decides to use plutonium as fertilizer. Because why not? This produces a bizarre hybrid plant that's a cross between a tomato and tobacco. Homer calls it tomacco. The fruit is disgusting and mildly radioactive, but it's incredibly addictive. Farm animals try it once and immediately can't stop eating it. It's a great gag about agricultural science gone wrong. But here's where it crosses from fiction into reality. A Simpsons fan named Rob Bohr in Oregon decided to actually try making tobacco. Not with plutonium, obviously, but using real grafting techniques. In 2003, Bauer successfully grafted a tobacco root onto a tomato stem and created an actual tobacco plant. The resulting fruit did contain nicotine, just like in the show, although at much lower levels. Bauer's creation got significant media attention, and the Simpsons writers were so impressed that they invited him and his family to visit their offices, and they even ate the tobacco fruit themselves. I love this one because it flips the whole prediction thing on its head. The Simpsons didn't predict tobacco would exist. They inspired someone to create it. It's a case of fiction influencing reality rather than predicting it. but the result is the same. Something that was a joke on a cartoon became a real thing that exists in the world. And while we're talking about nature and science intersecting with Simpsons predictions, we need to talk about Blinky. Blinky the three-eyed fish. In 1990, Season 2 aired 2 cars in every garage and 3 eyes on every fish. The episode introduces Blinky, a three-eyed fish that's found in the waters near Springfield's nuclear power plant. The implication is obvious. The nuclear plant is leaking radiation, and the radiation is causing mutations in the local wildlife. Mr. Burns tries to spin it as a positive because of course he does, but the message is clear. In 2011, a three-eyed fish was actually discovered near a nuclear power plant in Cordoba, Argentina. The fish was found in a reservoir that received cooling water from the plant. Photos went viral almost immediately, and the comparisons to Blinky were everywhere. Now, the real fish wasn't the same species as Blinky, and the exact cause of the mutation wasn't confirmed to be radiation, though speculation certainly pointed in that direction. But a three-eyed fish near a nuclear power plant is about as on the nose as a real-life Simpsons prediction can get. This was also around the same time as the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, which happened in March 2011. In the aftermath of Fukushima, reports emerged of mutated vegetables and deformed animals in the region surrounding the plant. Some of those mutated vegetables, particularly tomatoes and other produce, looked like something straight out of The Simpsons. It wasn't exactly the Tamako episode, but the imagery of nuclear contamination producing bizarre plant mutations was uncomfortably familiar to anyone who'd seen the show. There's another business world prediction that I think is really entertaining, partly because it involves a crime that sounds too absurd to be real. In 1998, Season 10 aired Lard of the Dance. There's a subplot where Homer and Bart discover that used restaurant grease is actually valuable and can be sold. So naturally, they start stealing it. They go around to restaurants, collect the used cooking oil, and try to sell it for profit. It's a classic Homer get-rich-quick scheme, and like most of Homer's plans, it doesn't go particularly well. But in the years since, grease theft has become a genuine real-world crime. Used cooking oil, it turns out, is valuable. Really valuable. It can be converted into biodiesel, and as biofuel demand has increased, so has the price of used cooking oil. In New York and other major cities, there have been organized grease theft operations where criminals steal used cooking oil from restaurant dumpsters and sell it to biofuel producers. We're talking about thefts worth tens of thousands of dollars. There was a period in the 2000s where grease theft was making headlines regularly, with restaurants installing locks on their grease bins and some even putting up surveillance cameras to catch the thieves. Homer Simpson ahead of the curve on the grease hustle by about 15 years. Honestly, if Homer had stuck with it, he might have actually made money for once. And here's one more from the business and science world that I want to touch on before we move to pop culture predictions. In 2005, Season 16 aired Midnight RX. In the episode, Homer and a group of Springfield residents, including Ned Flanders, travel to Canada to buy cheap prescription drugs because they can't afford them in the United States. While they're there, Ned Flanders is offered cannabis, and he's shocked to learn that it's legal in Canada. In 2005, cannabis was not legal in Canada. Not recreationally, anyway. It was the subject of ongoing political debate, but recreational legalization wouldn't happen until 2018. The Simpsons presented it as an already done deal 13 years early. The writers were clearly aware that Canada was more progressive on the issue than the United States, and they extrapolated that trend to its logical conclusion. It wasn't a huge leap, but it was still technically a prediction and a correct one. The pharmaceutical tourism angle is interesting too. Americans traveling to Canada to buy cheaper medication has been a real and growing phenomenon for years, driven by the massive price gap between US and Canadian drug prices. The episode was satirizing something that was already happening to some degree, but the practice has only expanded since then, making the episode feel more relevant now than it did when it aired. I also want to mention something that I think is one of the more underrated predictions, and that involves the billionaire space race. In several episodes across the show's run, there are jokes about wealthy people going to space. One notable instance involves Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin Records and Virgin Atlantic, being shown in zero gravity aboard a spacecraft. In the show, it's played as a gag about the ultra-rich having nothing better to do with their money. In July 2021, Branson became the first billionaire to travel to space on a vehicle developed by his own company, Virgin Galactic. He beat Jeff Bezos to the milestone by about 9 days. The whole billionaire space race, with Branson, Bezos, and Elon Musk all competing to commercialize space travel, was one of the defining stories of the early 2000s. The Simpsons had been joking about it for years. And while we're on the topic of Elon Musk, he actually appeared on The Simpsons in 2015 in an episode called The Musk Who Fell to Earth. In the episode, Musk comes to Springfield with all sorts of grandiose ideas about transforming the town through technology and renewable energy. Things go predictably sideways. I won't call this a prediction per se, but the show's portrayal of Musk as a well-meaning but chaotic disruptor who leaves destruction in his wake has aged in a way that many fans find pretty telling. All right, let's pivot to entertainment and pop culture predictions, because honestly, some of the most fun and visually striking ones fall into this category. And I want to start with one that made headlines all over the world when it happened. In 2012, season 23 aired an episode called Lisa Goes Gaga. It's actually one of the lowest rated episodes in the show's history, which is kind of ironic given what I'm about to tell you. The episode features Lady Gaga as herself, visiting Springfield to perform a concert. During her performance, she descends from the sky on wires, wearing a silver and sparkly outfit, performing for a massive crowd below. She's suspended in the air, flying over the audience on cables, and it's this big, dramatic spectacle. 5 years later, on February 5th, 2017, Lady Gaga performed the halftime show at Super Bowl LI. And during that performance, she descended from the roof of NRG Stadium in Houston, Texas on wires, wearing a silver and sparkly outfit, performing for a massive crowd below. The similarities were so obvious that side-by-side comparisons flooded social media within minutes of the performance. Now, here's the thing I think is worth being honest about. Lady Gaga had seen the Simpsons episode. She literally appeared in it. She voiced herself. She knew what her animated counterpart did. So when she was designing her Super Bowl halftime show, there's a very real possibility, maybe even a likelihood, that the Simpsons episode influenced her creative choices, whether consciously or unconsciously. In that sense, this might not be a prediction so much as an inspiration. The show didn't foresee what Lady Gaga would do. Lady Gaga may have drawn from what the show had already imagined, but even with that caveat, the visual parallel is striking. And it feeds into what I think is one of the most interesting aspects of the Simpsons prediction phenomenon, which is that sometimes the show doesn't predict the future, it helps create it. We saw it with the autocorrect thing, where Apple engineers used the Simpsons joke as a reference point. We saw it with Tomako, where a fan literally grew the fictional plant. And we see it here with Lady Gaga, where a real performance may have been shaped by a fictional one. The line between prediction and influence gets blurry. And I think that's actually more fascinating than straightforward prophecy. Speaking of which, let me tell you about the Cypress Hill and London Symphony Orchestra prediction, because this one is genuinely amazing, and it took 28 years to come true. In 1996, Season 7 aired Homerpalooza. The episode is about Homer feeling old and out of touch, so he goes to a music festival to prove he's still cool. The episode features several real bands, including the Smashing Pumpkins, Sonic Youth, and Peter Frampton. But the band that matters for our purposes is Cypress Hill, the hip-hop group from Los Angeles. In the episode, there's a backstage scene where someone announces that the London Symphony Orchestra has arrived and that they were apparently booked by Cypress Hill, possibly while the group was high. There's this great moment of confusion where the LSO thinks a Glock refers to a glockenspiel, and Cypress Hill is just kind of bewildered by the whole situation. The joke is the absurd culture clash between a hardcore hip-hop group and one of the world's most prestigious classical orchestras. Now fast forward to 2024, 28 years later. Cypress Hill actually performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall in London. It really happened. The group acknowledged the Simpsons joke and embraced it. They performed their music with full orchestral accompaniment, and by all accounts, it was incredible. The concert was a sellout and became one of the most talked about musical events of the year. This is one of those predictions where you can argue it both ways. Did The Simpsons predict that Cypress Hill would perform with the LSO? Or did the Simpsons joke plant the idea in everyone's head, and after 28 years, someone finally said, you know what, let's just do it? Either way, the result is the same. A joke from a 1996 cartoon became a real concert in 2024, and it was apparently awesome. Now let me talk about a prediction that's a bit more subtle, but which I find really impressive because of how specific the timing is. In 2004, season 15 aired The Ziff Who Came to Dinner. The episode features Artie Ziff, Marge's self-absorbed former prom date, hiding out in the Simpsons' attic after the collapse of his tech company. He's being investigated for fraud, and the episode has all sorts of comedy around corporate malfeasance and financial crimes. But here's the prediction part. In the background of one scene, there's a movie poster on the wall. If you pause at exactly the right moment, you can see it's an ad for Matrix 4, with Keanu Reeves wearing a Santa hat, suggesting it's a Christmas release. In 2004, The Matrix Revolutions, the third film in the franchise, had already come out, and there was absolutely no indication that a fourth movie would ever be made. The trilogy seemed done. But 17 years later, on December 22nd, 2021, The Matrix Resurrections was released. A fourth Matrix movie with Keanu Reeves right before Christmas. The Simpsons had a freeze-frame gag in the background of a completely unrelated episode that called both the existence of a fourth Matrix film and its approximate release window, nearly 2 decades in advance. This is the kind of prediction that I think separates The Simpsons from other shows. It's not even a plot point. It's not dialogue. It's a poster in the background that you'd only notice if you pause the episode at the right frame. The Simpsons is full of these background details, what fans call freeze-frame gags, and some of them have turned out to be unexpectedly prophetic. It makes you wonder how many other background details are hiding future predictions that we haven't noticed yet because the events haven't happened. Let me move on to a prediction that involves one of the most prestigious awards in the world. In the fall of 2010, season 22 premiered with an episode called Elementary School Musical. In the episode, there is a scene where Milhouse is filling out a prediction sheet, trying to impress Lisa as usual. Among his predictions is that Bengt Holmstrom of MIT will win the Nobel Prize in Economics. In 2010, Holmstrom was a respected economist, certainly, but he wasn't exactly a household name. Picking him specifically as a Nobel laureate was a deep-cut reference that most viewers probably glossed over. But in 2016, 6 years after the episode aired, Bengt Holmstrom did indeed win the Nobel Prize in Economics, sharing it with Oliver Hart for their work on contract theory. The Simpsons didn't just predict that someone would win the Nobel Prize, they predicted which specific person would win it years before it happened. That's not throwing darts, that's calling your shot. Whoever on the writing staff picked Holmstrom clearly knew enough about the field of economics to recognize that his work was Nobel-worthy well before the committee agreed. Given the academic pedigree of the writer's room, this actually makes a lot of sense. These are people who read academic journals for fun. I mentioned this earlier when talking about Lisa's wedding, but I want to circle back to The Shard because I think the visual evidence is really compelling. In that 1995 episode set in 2010, there's an establishing shot of the London skyline. You can see Big Ben, Tower Bridge, the usual landmarks. But there's also a tall, pointed, triangular building in the background that doesn't correspond to any real structure that existed in London at the time. The Shard was designed by architect Renzo Piano, and construction began in 2009. It was completed in 2012, and when it opened, it was the tallest building in the European Union. If you compare the Simpsons skyline to a real photo of modern London taken from a similar angle, the resemblance between the Mystery Building and the Shard is genuinely startling. The shape, the proportions, even the general position relative to other landmarks, it all lines up. Now, I want to be fair. The building in the episode was almost certainly just a generic futuristic skyscraper. The animators needed London to look different from 1995 London, so they added some tall buildings to the skyline. They weren't designing an actual structure. But the fact that London went and built something that matches the cartoon version so closely is one of those delightful coincidences that keeps the prediction legend alive. And since I mentioned Lisa's wedding again, there's one more detail from that episode that I want to cover. There's a background gag showing a poster for the Rolling Stones Steel Wheelchair Tour 2010. The joke being that the Stones, who were already considered ancient by 1995 standards, would still be touring 15 years later, but would need wheelchairs to do it. As of right now, the Rolling Stones are still actively touring. Mick Jagger, who was born in 1943, is still performing at a level that would exhaust most people half his age. No wheelchairs yet, but the prediction that they'd still be at it in 2010 and beyond was absolutely correct. In fact, they may never stop. Let me also talk about a prediction that's less about a specific event and more about a cultural phenomenon. In Season 3, which aired in 1991, there's an episode called Stark Raving Dad, where Homer meets a man in a psychiatric hospital who claims to be Michael Jackson. The episode features original music, and it became one of the most beloved episodes of the show's run. But that's not the prediction part. The prediction part is more about what happened to the episode itself. In 2019, following the release of the HBO documentary Leaving Neverland, which detailed allegations of child sexual abuse against Michael Jackson, the Simpsons producers pulled Stark Raving Dad from circulation entirely. It was removed from Disney Plus, from syndication, from DVD sets. It became the only Simpsons episode ever to be completely removed from all official distribution. The show essentially erased it. I mention this not because The Simpsons predicted the Michael Jackson controversy specifically, but because the way the episode was handled reflects a broader cultural shift that the show's writers have been commenting on for decades. The idea that something beloved and innocent can become tainted, that cultural artifacts carry the baggage of the people associated with them, that's a recurring theme across the show. And the fact that the show itself had to reckon with that theme in a very real way by pulling one of its own episodes is a kind of meta prediction about where entertainment culture was heading. Now, speaking of cultural shifts, there's a prediction about censorship and art that I find really interesting. In 1990, Season 2 aired Itchy and Scratchy and Marge. In the episode, a copy of Michelangelo's David is brought to Springfield, and some citizens are outraged by its nudity. They demand that the statue be given pants. As a satire about prudishness and the tension between art and decency standards, classic Simpsons commentary. In 2023, a school principal in Tallahassee, Florida was pressured to resign after showing students an image of Michelangelo's David during a Renaissance art class. A parent had complained that the image was pornographic. The story made international news and reignited debates about education, censorship, and what constitutes appropriate art exposure for young people. The Simpsons had made exactly the same point 33 years earlier, that some people would look at one of the most famous and celebrated works of art in human history and see something obscene. It's the kind of social commentary that the show excels at, taking a real cultural tension and pushing it to a comedic extreme, only for reality to later match the extreme. Since we've been going for a while now and I've covered a lot of the big headline predictions, I want to take some time to go through a bunch of the smaller, quirkier ones that don't always get as much attention, but which I think are equally entertaining. Think of this section like a rapid-fire round, not as deep on each one, but covering more ground. In 1995, Season 6 aired Lemon of Troy. The plot is about the kids of Springfield going to war against the kids of rival town Shelbyville after those pesky Shelbyville kids dig up and steal Springfield's beloved lemon tree. It's a parody of the Trojan War, specifically the Helen of Troy story, but applied to kids fighting over a citrus tree. In 2013, in Houston, Texas, a real-life thief actually dug up and stole a lemon tree from someone's front yard. The homeowner came outside to find a hole where her tree used to be. It made the local news, and Simpsons fans immediately made the connection. Of all the crimes you could commit, digging up and stealing someone's lemon tree has to be one of the most Simpsons things possible. It's so specific and so absurd that you almost have to wonder if the thief was a fan of the show. In 1992, Season 3 aired Homer at the Bat. In a subplot, Mr. Burns tells star baseball player Don Mattingly that he can't play because of his sideburns. Mattingly keeps trimming them but can never satisfy Burns, who keeps insisting they're too long even when there's clearly nothing left to trim. It's one of the funniest gags in the episode. 1 year later, in 1993, the real Don Mattingly had a real-world confrontation with New York Yankees management over his hair. Manager Stump Merrill reportedly benched Mattingly for refusing to get a haircut on game day. The parallels were so obvious that it became one of the earliest examples people point to when discussing Simpsons predictions. The episode aired before the real incident happened, so it's not like the writers were referencing something that had already occurred. They just happened to pick Mattingly for the bit, and reality followed suit. In 1992, there's also an episode where Homer's half-brother Herb comes up with the idea of a baby translator, which I mentioned earlier. But that same season, in a different episode called Itchy and Scratchy, the Movie, there's a brief flash forward to the year 2013. And in that future, Supreme Court Chief Justice Bart Simpson announces that Soylent Green is not people. It hasn't come true yet, obviously, but it's a fun detail that shows how the writers were always thinking about what the future might look like, even in throwaway moments. Here's another fun one. In 1994, Season 5 had Deep Space Homer, where NASA decides to boost their ratings by sending an average citizen to space. They pick Homer, who is about as far from astronaut material as you can get. The whole episode is about Homer bumbling through space training and eventually making it to orbit, where he manages to break an ant farm and nearly destroy the shuttle. The prediction here is more about the concept than a specific event. The idea of a civilian, someone with no scientific or military background going to space, was largely science fiction in 1994. NASA's astronaut program was highly selective and required extensive training and education. But starting in the 2010s and accelerating in the 2020s, space tourism became a real thing. SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Virgin Galactic have all sent civilians to space. Some of them had as much business being up there as Homer did, if you ask certain critics. The Simpsons saw that the democratization, or maybe the commercialization of space travel was coming, and they turned it into a Homer episode. In a 2008 episode, Treehouse of Horror 19, there's a segment that parodies Transformers. But one of the background gags that people picked up on later involves Homer ordering something through a device that looks remarkably like what we'd now recognize as a smart home assistant. He speaks to it, it responds, and it handles the request. In 2014, Amazon released the Echo and Alexa. In 2016, Google released Google Home, smart speakers that you talk to and that manage tasks for you. The Simpsons version was played as a throwaway futuristic gag, but it turned out to be a pretty accurate preview of how millions of people interact with technology in their homes today. There's also the Smart House prediction from Treehouse of Horror 12 for Calcanium, which aired in 2001. In that episode, the Simpsons house is converted into an automated smart home controlled by an AI voiced by Pierce Brosnan. The house manages everything: the thermostat, the cooking, the cleaning, the security, all through voice commands and automated systems. Things go wrong when the AI falls in love with Marge and tries to kill Homer because it's a Halloween episode, but the underlying technology of a connected, automated home managed by AI is basically what companies like Google, Amazon, and Apple have been building with their smart home ecosystems. Now I know that the concept of a smart house existed in science fiction long before The Simpsons. The Jetsons had it. Various sci-fi novels explored it. But The Simpsons presented it in such a specific, domestic, relatable way as something that would just be part of normal suburban American life, that it feels closer to reality than the flying car version of the future. And the detail of things going wrong because the technology has too much control over our lives is a genuine concern that people discuss today with regards to AI, data privacy, and home automation. One last one before we move on. In a 2010 episode, Lisa is shown using what appears to be a tablet device that looks a lot like an iPad. The iPad was actually released in 2010, so this one might have been the writers being current rather than predictive. But there are earlier episodes going back to the late 90s that show characters using flat, tablet-like devices for reading and communication. The writers clearly had their finger on the pulse of where personal technology was heading. I want to take a moment here to talk about something that I think really ties all of these predictions together, and that's the people who write this show. Because I keep coming back to this point, and I think it deserves more than just a passing mention. The Simpsons writing staff is not what you'd expect from a cartoon. These aren't just comedy writers. They're some of the most academically accomplished people working in entertainment. Let me give you some specifics. Al Jean, who has been the showrunner for the majority of the show's run and is one of the most important figures in the show's history, entered Harvard at the age of 16 to study mathematics. Not creative writing, not film studies, mathematics. He was essentially a math prodigy who happened to find his way into comedy. Jeff Westbrook, who wrote for the show for years, has a PhD in computer science from Princeton. Ken Keeler, who wrote for both The Simpsons and Futurama, has a PhD in applied mathematics from Harvard. David X. Cohen, who we talked about earlier with the Higgs boson equation, has a physics degree from Harvard and a master's in computer science from UC Berkeley. J. Stuart Burns has a master's in mathematics from UC Berkeley. The list goes on. The Harvard Lampoon, which is Harvard University's humor magazine, has been a direct pipeline to The Simpsons writers' room since the very beginning. The Lampoon is one of the most prestigious and competitive comedy organizations in the country, and its alumni have gone on to work on some of the most important comedy shows in television history. But The Simpsons has benefited from this pipeline more than almost any other show. Why does this matter for predictions? Because these aren't people who are just riffing. When they write a joke about technology, they understand the technology. When they write about politics, they've studied political science and history. When they include a mathematical equation on a chalkboard, it's not random symbols. It's a real equation crafted by someone who understands the underlying physics. Al Jean addressed this directly in an interview once. He said that the writers spend a lot of time discussing current events, trends, and where things seem to be heading. They read voraciously. They follow the news. They talk to experts. And then they take all of that information and ask themselves, what's the funniest possible version of where this is going? That process of taking real trends and extrapolating them to comedic extremes is essentially scenario planning disguised as joke writing. And sometimes the scenarios they come up with turn out to be accurate because they're based on real data and real understanding. Stephanie Gillis, another Simpsons writer, put it a different way. She said there are so many things happening in the world, and she and the other writers spend a lot of time discussing these things outside of work. The show is a product of hundreds of smart, curious people paying close attention to the world around them and then filtering that through comedy. When your sample size is over 800 episodes and your writers are essentially professional trend analysts who happen to be funny, you're going to hit some bullseyes. And here's another detail about the writing process that I think is worth mentioning because it sheds light on how these predictions happen at a practical level. The Simpsons writers' room operates on a rewrite system where scripts go through multiple drafts. A single episode might be rewritten a dozen times. Each draft brings in new jokes, new background gags, new details. And because there are so many writers contributing to each script, each episode contains the collective observations and ideas of a large group of highly intelligent people. That means any given episode isn't the product of one person's imagination. It's the product of a room full of Harvard graduates, PhDs, and voracious readers all contributing their individual observations about the world. One writer might suggest a background gag about a tech trend they read about. Another might throw in a political reference based on something they discussed over dinner. A third might add a freeze-frame joke that references an academic paper. Each of these contributions is a tiny data point. And when you multiply them across hundreds of episodes and thousands of writers over 3 decades, the total number of data points about the real world embedded in the show is staggeringly large. This is fundamentally different from how most TV shows work. Most shows have smaller writing staffs, shorter runs, and narrower topical ranges. The Simpsons' unique combination of scale, talent, and breadth gives it more opportunities to accidentally predict things than any other show has ever had. I think this is the most important takeaway when it comes to understanding why The Simpsons seems to predict the future. It's not magic, it's not time travel. It's a combination of enormous volume, incredibly smart writers, and a format that encourages taking real-world trends to their logical extremes. The predictions are a byproduct of brilliant satire, but enough philosophy for now. Let's get back to the predictions themselves, because we've got plenty more to cover and I want to make sure we hit all the good ones. Let me talk about a really fun cluster of predictions that all relate to things that seemed impossible or absurd at the time, but which turned out to be perfectly normal. Starting with one that I think perfectly captures the spirit of the whole phenomenon. In 1996, Season 8 aired Bart After Dark. It's the episode where Bart starts working at a burlesque house, which obviously creates problems. But the prediction isn't about the plot. In the background of one scene, there's a device that looks remarkably like a first-generation iPod. The rectangular shape, the circular navigation wheel, the general size and proportions. Apple wouldn't release the iPod until October 2001, 5 years after this episode aired. Now, I mentioned this one briefly before, but I want to expand on it because I think the iPod prediction is a good example of how design language evolves and how sometimes a cartoon animation just happens to match where industrial design is heading. In the mid to late 1990s, portable music players existed. Sony's Walkman had been around since 1979, and the Discman had been around since 1984. The idea of a small portable device for listening to music wasn't new. What was new about the iPod was its specific design, the minimalism, the scroll wheel, the white aesthetic. And while the Simpsons animation doesn't match the iPod in every detail, the resemblance is close enough that it caught people's attention. Is this a genuine prediction? Honestly, I'm on the fence. I think it's possible that the animators were designing a generic futuristic device and happened to land on a form factor that Apple would later popularize. But it's also possible that the design trends that would eventually lead to the iPod were already in the air in 1996, and both the animators and Apple's design team were drawing from the same cultural well. Speaking of things that seemed absurd at the time, let me talk about the virtual reality theme park prediction. In Itchy and Scratchy Land, which aired in 1994, the Simpson family visits a theme park that's essentially a parody of Disneyland but with violent cartoon robots. The park features immersive experiences, animatronics that interact with guests, and technology that blurs the line between ride and reality. While The Simpsons was obviously parodying existing theme parks, the level of immersion depicted in the episode anticipated developments that wouldn't become mainstream for decades. Disney's Star Wars: Galaxy's Edge, which opened in 2019, features interactive elements where cast members stay in character, droids roam the streets, and guests can interact with the environment in ways that go far beyond traditional theme park experiences. Universal's new Epic Universe Park, which opened in 2025, pushes the immersion even further. The idea of a theme park as a fully realized interactive world rather than just a collection of rides was something The Simpsons was riffing on back in 1994. Let me also circle back to the food and agriculture theme because there are a couple more predictions in this area that I think are worth covering. In the same E-I-E-I-D-O episode where Homer invents tobacco, there's a broader joke about genetically modified food and the potential consequences of messing with nature for profit. Homer uses radioactive material to boost his crop yields, which is obviously an extreme version of agricultural modification, but the underlying concern about genetic modification, corporate agriculture, and the safety of our food supply is something that has only become more relevant in the decades since. The GMO debate really exploded in the 2000s and 2010s with major controversies around Monsanto, genetically modified crops, and consumer right-to-know legislation. Countries around the world have taken different approaches, with some embracing GMOs and others banning them entirely. The Simpsons didn't predict GMOs themselves, obviously those existed before the episode, but they captured the anxiety around them in a way that feels pretty ahead of its time. There's also the food-related prediction from season 14, where Homer discovers that he can make money by organizing competitive eating contests. This was in 2003, right around the time that competitive eating was starting to become a genuine phenomenon in America. Nathan's famous hot dog eating contest had been running for years, but it was in the early 2000s that it really became a televised spectacle, largely thanks to Joey Chestnut's rise to fame. The Simpsons was tapping into a trend that was just beginning to go mainstream. Now let me get into some predictions that are a bit more out there, the ones where I think the writers might have gotten lucky rather than being prescient, but which are still too fun to skip. There's the Game of Thrones one. In 2017, season 29 aired The Simpsons, a medieval-themed episode that takes place in a fantasy world. In the episode, there's a scene where a dragon sets fire to a crowd of people. 2 years later, in 2019, Game of Thrones aired its divisive final season. in which Daenerys Targaryen's dragon destroys King's Landing and burns innocent civilians alive. Fans immediately drew comparisons to the Simpsons episode. Is this a real prediction? Honestly, it's a stretch. Dragons burning things is kind of what dragons do. It's been a trope in fantasy fiction for centuries. But the timing and the cultural context coming right before the most talked about TV finale in years made people notice it. And once people start looking for Simpsons predictions, they tend to find them everywhere, which brings us back to the whole confirmation bias thing. But here's one that I don't think is a stretch at all, and it involves one of the most dramatic moments in recent American political history. In the Simpsons movie from 2007, there's a scene where an angry mob storms a government building. The imagery of citizens breaching the walls of a government institution was played for comedy in the movie, but it took on new significance on January 6, 2021, when a mob stormed the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Now, I want to be careful here because the situations are very different. The Simpsons movie mob was angry about environmental issues. The real Capitol breach was motivated by completely different circumstances. And the idea of angry mobs storming buildings has existed in fiction and reality throughout history. But the visual comparison made the rounds on social media almost immediately after January 6th, and it added another entry to the growing list of Simpsons moments that seem to mirror future events. Let me get into a batch of predictions that are less dramatic, but which I think showcase the range of topics the show has managed to accidentally prophesy. Because it's not all politics and technology. Sometimes The Simpsons predicts the weirdest, most random things imaginable. In 1994, in a brief gag, there's a scene where characters are seen playing games on devices that closely resemble modern handheld gaming consoles. The Game Boy existed in 1994, but the devices in the show look more like what would eventually become the Nintendo DS or even the Nintendo Switch, with their dual screens and more sophisticated form factors. In 2003, the Bart Wants What It Wants features Bart going to Toronto. In one scene, the skyline of the city is shown, but it includes a building that looks very similar to the Absolute World Towers in Mississauga, Ontario, which weren't completed until 2012. These buildings, nicknamed the Marilyn Monroe Towers because of their curvy design, became architectural landmarks. Like the Shard prediction, this could easily be a coincidence, with the animators just drawing interesting-looking buildings to fill out a skyline. But the resemblance is noted by fans. There's a prediction about farm-raised salmon that I think is an interesting one. In a 1999 episode, Lisa warns about the dangers of genetically altered fish escaping into the wild and contaminating natural fish populations. This became a genuine concern in the early 2000s as genetically modified salmon was developed, and debates raged about whether it should be approved for human consumption. The FDA eventually approved genetically modified salmon for sale in the United States in 2015, and environmental groups continued to raise exactly the concerns that Lisa had voiced 16 years earlier. In 2010, there's an episode where Homer and Marge discover that their phone calls are being recorded, and their private conversations are being monitored, not by the government, but by a private corporation. This was before the Cambridge Analytica scandal, before widespread public awareness of how much data tech companies collect on their users, and before the broader privacy reckoning that's been unfolding throughout the 2020s. The show wasn't just worried about government surveillance. They were worried about corporate surveillance too, and they were right to be. There's also a fun little prediction about Tom Hanks that I want to mention. In the Simpsons movie, Tom Hanks makes a cameo where he basically serves as a spokesperson for the government, lending his trustworthy image to help the authorities look credible. He says something along the lines of the government has lost the public's trust, so they brought in someone the American people do trust. It's a joke about how Hanks is seen as one of the most trusted and likable people in America. In 2022, Tom Hanks appeared in an advertisement for the Biden administration that essentially did the same thing. Hanks narrated a message about the country's progress and resilience, lending his warm, trusted voice to a government message at a time when public trust in institutions was at a low point. It wasn't exactly the same context as the movie, but the core idea of using Tom Hanks' credibility to make a government message more palatable was the same. And since we're talking about movies and entertainment predictions, let me mention one more quick one. In 1995, there is a brief gag showing what movie theaters will look like in the future. And one of the movies being shown is a sequel that hadn't been made yet. This kind of thing happens throughout the show, where fictional movie posters advertise sequels or reboots that would eventually become real. The Matrix 4-1 is the most famous. There are others scattered throughout the series where the writers jokingly predicted that Hollywood would keep making sequels to everything, which, well, look around. We live in the age of the sequel, the reboot, the remake, and the extended universe. The Simpsons saw it coming because the trends were already there. Hollywood has always loved a franchise. Let me also address some of the predictions that people claim The Simpsons made, but which, when you look at them closely, don't really hold up. Because I think it's important to be honest about this and not just pile on every claim prediction without scrutiny. One of the most commonly cited predictions is that The Simpsons predicted 9/11. This claim comes from a scene in The City of New York versus Homer Simpson, which aired in 1997. In the episode, there's a shot of a bus advertisement showing a $9 price next to an image of the Twin Towers, creating a visual that looks like it reads 9/11. People have pointed to this for years as evidence that the show predicted the September 11th attacks. This is not a prediction, it's a coincidence. The $9 was a price for a bus ride to New York, and the Twin Towers were shown because the episode is literally about New York City. The towers were the most prominent feature of the Manhattan skyline. Any show set in or referencing New York before 2001 would include them. The juxtaposition of the number 9 and the towers is pure coincidence. And the fact that it's become one of the most widely shared Simpsons predictions is a perfect example of how confirmation bias works. People see the number 9 and the towers and their brains make a connection that isn't there. Similarly, some people claim The Simpsons predicted specific celebrity deaths or specific natural disasters. In most of these cases, the connections are extremely tenuous. The show has featured characters dying or references to dangers that are common enough that you could retroactively apply them to almost any real-world event. Earthquakes, floods, celebrity scandals, these are things that happen regularly, and a show with 800 episodes will inevitably have referenced them at some point. Snopes, the fact-checking website, has debunked several claimed Simpsons predictions. They've pointed out that the show's enormous volume of content means, and I quote their reasoning, "There are a lot of jokes and a lot of opportunities for coincidence. The human brain is wired to find patterns, and when you're looking for connections between a massive library of fictional content and the entire span of real-world events, you're going to find them whether they're meaningful or not." I think being honest about the misses actually makes the genuine predictions more impressive. When you strip away the stretches and the false claims, what you're left with is still a remarkably long list of things that The Simpsons legitimately got right. And the real ones don't need any embellishment. They speak for themselves. Now that we've talked about the ones that don't hold up, let me get back to the ones that absolutely do, because we're far from done. There's a prediction from the show that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and it involves the discovery of a new state of matter. Well, sort of. In The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace, the same episode where Homer writes the Higgs boson equation on the blackboard, there's actually a second equation on a different part of the board. This equation deals with the topology of a particular type of three-dimensional shape, and some mathematicians have pointed out that it relates to concepts that wouldn't be fully explored in academic literature for years after the episode aired. I bring this up not because it's a specific real-world prediction, but because it illustrates a broader point. The chalkboards in The Simpsons are not random. They are crafted by people who understand mathematics at a very high level, and they contain actual mathematical content that repays close examination. Simon Singh, the physicist I mentioned earlier, wrote an entire book about this called The Simpsons and Their Mathematical Secrets. In it, he catalogs the mathematical references throughout the show, from pi to Fermat's last theorem to complex geometry, and makes a compelling case that The Simpsons is one of the most mathematically sophisticated shows in television history. This matters for our purposes because it means that when The Simpsons makes a scientific or mathematical prediction, it's coming from a place of genuine knowledge. The Higgs boson equation wasn't a lucky guess. It was an informed estimate by someone who understood particle physics well enough to write a plausible equation. And that's the secret sauce of a lot of these predictions. They're not wild shots in the dark. They're educated extrapolations by very smart people who happen to express their intelligence through comedy. Let me shift to talking about some predictions that involve broader societal trends rather than specific events, because I think these are in some ways more impressive than the specific ones, even if they don't make for headlines that are as catchy. Throughout its run, The Simpsons has consistently depicted the decline of the American middle class, the erosion of stable employment, the growing gap between the wealthy and everyone else, and the slow deterioration of public institutions. Homer works at a nuclear power plant that's been dangerous and poorly managed since the first episode. The town of Springfield is perpetually dysfunctional. Public schools are underfunded, infrastructure is crumbling, and the local government is corrupt and incompetent. In the early 1990s, some of this was exaggeration. But over the past 3 decades, the trends the show was satirizing have only accelerated. Income inequality has widened dramatically. Manufacturing jobs have disappeared. Public infrastructure in many American cities has deteriorated. Trust in government institutions has plummeted. The Springfield that seemed like a caricature in 1990 looks a lot more like reality in 2026. This is maybe the most profound prediction The Simpsons has made, and it's not one that fits neatly into a meme. You can't make a side-by-side screenshot comparing Springfield's broken roads to a pothole in Topeka, Kansas. But the show's writers understood decades ago where certain trends in American society were heading. They could see the arc because they were paying attention, and they expressed what they saw through satire. The fact that the satire has become less exaggerated over time says more about the state of the country than it does about the show. On a somewhat lighter note, let me talk about a category of predictions that I find really charming, which is the show's predictions about itself. The Simpsons has been remarkably self-aware throughout its run, frequently making jokes about its own longevity, its relationship with its network, and the state of the entertainment industry. In season 12, there's an episode called Behind the Laughter, a mockumentary that parodies VH1's Behind the Music. In the episode, the family is depicted as real people whose personal lives are falling apart behind the scenes of their TV show. At the end, they look forward to many more years of episodes, and the narrator suggests that the show will continue for a long, long time. In 2000, when this episode aired, the show had been on for 11 seasons and was already one of the longest-running series on television. The idea that it would still be going 25 years later, past its 800th episode, was treated as a joke. And yet, here we are. The show was renewed through season 40 in April 2025. It's not just still going, it's going to keep going for the foreseeable future. The show predicted its own immortality, and so far, it's been right. There's also the meta aspect of the Disney acquisition that I touched on earlier, but want to expand on. In multiple episodes across the show's run, characters have made jokes about Fox being a struggling network, about the show being canceled, about corporate mergers eating up media companies. The show has always been willing to bite the hand that feeds it, making fun of Fox even while airing on Fox. And then, in 2019, Fox's entertainment assets were sold to Disney. The Simpsons became Disney property, and the show immediately started making jokes about that too. They've produced Disney Plus exclusive shorts featuring Star Wars, Marvel, and other Disney properties. They've had characters interact with Disney characters. They've made jokes about being owned by the mouse. The show's ability to predict and then comment on and then profit from corporate media consolidation is a kind of prediction loop that goes beyond any single episode. Let me now talk about some more specific predictions that I've been saving because I think they work really well as a batch. These are ones where the detail is what gets you. First, there's the Canada legalizing cannabis prediction that I touched on earlier but want to give more context for. In the 2005 episode Midnight RX, the Springfield residents travel to Canada to buy cheaper prescription medications. While there, Ned Flanders, who is the most straight-laced, rule-following, religiously conservative character on the show, is offered cannabis and is shocked to discover it's legal. The writers use Canada's more progressive attitude toward cannabis as a cultural contrast with the United States. At the time recreational cannabis was not legal in Canada, Medical cannabis had been legal since 2001, but full recreational legalization didn't happen until October 2018, 13 years after the episode aired. The prediction here is less about cannabis specifically and more about the trajectory of Canadian policy. The writers could see that Canada was more progressive on drug policy than the United States, and they extrapolated that trend forward. When you're making jokes about a country that already has a more relaxed attitude towards something, predicting that they'll eventually go all the way with it isn't a huge leap. But it was still technically a prediction, and it was correct. Then there's the censorship prediction that goes beyond the David statue one. Throughout its run, The Simpsons has made numerous jokes about the tension between freedom of expression and the impulse to censor or sanitize content. There's the episode where Marge campaigns against violence in Itchy and Scratchy, which leads to the show being sanitized into boring, non-violent content that nobody wants to watch. There are episodes about book banning, about political correctness, about the ways that well-intentioned efforts to protect people from offensive content can go too far. These themes have become increasingly relevant in the 2020s. Debates about content warnings, trigger warnings, book bans in schools, social media moderation, and the boundaries of acceptable speech have dominated public discourse. The Simpsons has been exploring these tensions since the early 1990s, consistently arguing through its satire that the impulse to control what people say, see, and think is both understandable and dangerous. Now, here's one that I stumbled across while researching, and I think it's one of the best obscure ones. In 2013, season 24 aired The Saga of Carl. In the episode, a news ticker similar to the Greece one we talked about earlier shows a headline about the world's population reaching a certain milestone. The specific number and the timing of the prediction lined up closely with actual demographic data that was released years later. This is another example of the writers being tuned into real-world trends and extrapolating them forward. Population growth isn't mysterious or unpredictable. The data is out there for anyone who cares to look. But the fact that a cartoon got it right is still kind of fun. Let me also spend a minute on the show's relationship with Apple because it goes deeper than just the autocorrect joke. The Simpsons has been referencing Apple products since the early 1990s. The Apple Newton joke in Lisa on Ice is the most famous, but there are Apple computers visible in the background of numerous episodes throughout the show's run. Lisa, in particular, is often shown using Apple products, which makes sense given her character as an intellectual and creative type. The show has depicted video chat, tablets, smartwatches, and personal assistants, all technologies that Apple would eventually bring to the mainstream market. Some people have jokingly suggested that Apple's design team uses The Simpsons as a mood board. That's obviously not true, but the frequency with which the show's technology predictions align with Apple's product launches is notable. I think what's happening is simpler than conspiracy. Both The Simpsons writers and Apple's designers are smart people who pay attention to where technology is heading. They draw from the same pool of ideas about what the future of personal technology looks like. And because both groups are very good at what they do, they often arrive at similar conclusions independently. Let me now talk about something that I think is one of the most interesting meta aspects of the whole prediction phenomenon, and that's how the show has responded to its own reputation as a predictor of the future. As I mentioned earlier, the show is fully aware that people believe it predicts the future. And rather than shying away from it, the writers have leaned into it in ways that are both funny and clever. In season 34, episode 3, Lisa the Boy Scout, the show includes a segment where a time-traveling adult Bart appears in the show's first ever episode, the 1989 Christmas special, and starts rattling off predictions. He mentions Trump becoming president, pandemics, gas hoarding, Germany beating Brazil 7-1, and Disney buying Fox. It's the show explicitly winking at the audience and saying, "Yeah, we know." But what I find even more interesting is the way the show has started making predictions about its own prediction making. In various episodes and interviews, the writers have dropped hints about things they think will come true in the future, essentially daring reality to catch up. Al Jean once joked that they've predicted so many things that they're now just trying to see what else they can get right. There's a playfulness to it that I think makes the whole phenomenon more fun. There's also the question of whether the show's reputation has created a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. When Cypress Hill performs with the London Symphony Orchestra, is that because the universe unfolded in a way that led to that happening organically? Or is it because the Simpsons joke planted the idea, and after 28 years, someone decided to make it real? When Lady Gaga descends on wires at the Super Bowl, is that her own creative vision, or did seeing her animated self do it first influence the decision? I think the answer is probably a bit of both. The Simpsons is so deeply embedded in popular culture that it influences the decisions people make, sometimes consciously and sometimes not. When you grow up watching a show that imagines the future in vivid, specific detail, some of those imagined futures are going to get stuck in your head. And when you find yourself in a position to make decisions, some of those stuck images might influence what you choose to do. It's a cultural feedback loop. Rob Bauer growing tobacco, Apple engineers working to avoid the eat up Martha problem, Cypress Hill booking the LSO. These aren't predictions, they're inspirations. The Simpsons didn't see the future. It helped shape it. And honestly, I think that's more interesting than prediction. Prophecy implies that the future is fixed, that someone just saw what was coming. But influence implies something more dynamic. The Simpsons doesn't just observe the world. It participates in it. It throws ideas into the cultural ether, and some of those ideas take root. That's not fortune telling. That's what happens when a piece of art is so deeply embedded in a culture that it becomes part of the culture's operating system. Let me give you one more example of this before we move on. In multiple episodes, The Simpsons has depicted dystopian scenarios where automation and artificial intelligence replace human workers. Homer has been replaced by a machine more than once. Mr. Burns has fantasized about running the nuclear plant with robots instead of employees. The show has consistently treated the automation of labor as both a source of comedy and a source of genuine anxiety. In the 2020s, this anxiety has become mainstream. The rise of AI tools, including large language models, autonomous vehicles, and automated manufacturing, has sparked widespread debate about the future of work. People are genuinely worried about being replaced by machines, and governments are grappling with how to regulate AI in the workplace. The Simpsons was making these jokes in the 1990s and 2000s, and what felt like exaggeration then feels like commentary now. All right, we've been at this for a while now, and I want to make sure I cover a few more predictions before we start winding down. So let me rapid fire through some of the remaining ones that I think deserve mention. In 2012, The Simpsons depicted a tiger being used in a prank during a political event. While not a direct prediction of any specific incident, the use of big cats in various public stunts and viral moments became increasingly common throughout the 2010s and 2020s, culminating in the Tiger King phenomenon of 2020, when Joe Exotic and the world of private big cat ownership became the most talked about story on the internet during the early pandemic lockdowns. In 1997, Homer discovers that the food at his favorite restaurant has been substituting inferior ingredients, which foreshadowed not just the horse meat scandal, but the broader trend of food fraud that has been documented by investigative journalists and food safety agencies worldwide. Everything from fake olive oil to mislabeled fish to adulterated honey. The Simpsons recognize that when money is involved, the integrity of the food supply is always at risk. In a 2003 episode, there's a brief scene showing what appears to be a social media-like platform where people share updates about their lives and argue with strangers. In 2003, social media as we know it barely existed. MySpace was just launching. Facebook wouldn't be available to the general public until 2006. Twitter wouldn't launch until 2006 either. But the concept of people using technology to broadcast their lives and get into public arguments was already brewing in the Simpsons writers' imaginations. There's something I want to explore a bit more deeply before we continue, and it ties into the way the Simpsons functions as a kind of cultural time capsule. Because the predictions aren't just about specific events. They're about the show capturing the anxieties, hopes, and absurdities of each era it's passed through. And those captured moments end up resonating decades later in ways nobody expected. Think about it like this. When you watch a Simpsons episode from 1993, you're not just watching a comedy. You're watching a snapshot of what Americans were worried about, laughing about, and paying attention to in 1993. Globalization, cheap overseas manufacturing, public health scares, the decline of American industry, the rise of corporate power. All of these themes are woven into the fabric of early Simpsons episodes. And because the writers were so sharp at identifying the underlying currents of their time, those episodes end up feeling prophetic when the same currents produce bigger waves decades later. The Osaka flu episode is a perfect example. In 1993, globalization anxiety was already present but hadn't fully crystallized into the public consciousness. People were starting to notice that more and more products were being manufactured overseas, that supply chains were becoming international, and that this interconnectedness created vulnerabilities. The Simpsons writers identified that anxiety and turned it into a funny story about a flu spreading through a juicer from Japan. 27 years later, a real pandemic spread through international travel and commerce, and the parallels were obvious. But the writers weren't predicting COVID. They were reflecting the anxieties of their time. And those anxieties turned out to be well-founded, which is why the episode feels prophetic. The Simpsons is less a crystal ball and more a very accurate thermometer. It measures the temperature of the culture at a given moment, and sometimes the fever it detects early turns into a full-blown illness later. I want to apply the same lens to some of the technology predictions because I think it reveals something interesting about how innovation works. When Lisa's Wedding depicted smartwatches and video calling in 1995, the writers weren't inventing those ideas from scratch. They were pulling from decades of science fiction, from Star Trek communicators to Dick Tracy's wrist radio to video phones in the Jetsons. The concepts existed. What the Simpsons writers did was place them in a relatable, domestic context. Not on a starship, not in a detective story, but in the everyday life of a middle-class family. And that's the version that eventually came true. We didn't get video phones on spaceships. We got FaceTime on iPhones. We didn't get wrist communicators for secret agents. We got Apple Watches for checking our messages. The Simpsons understood that the future of technology wasn't going to be dramatic and cinematic. It was going to be mundane and domestic. And that insight that the most impactful technology would be the kind that integrates into ordinary life rather than replacing it is arguably more prescient than any specific device prediction. Let me now get into some more predictions that I've been holding back because they deserve their own space. There's the prediction about the Denver Broncos winning the Super Bowl. In Lisa the Greek, the same episode where Lisa predicts the Redskins winning, there's a running gag about Homer's terrible predictions. In various versions of the episode, different teams are named as the predicted winner. But in one rerun, the Broncos are mentioned, and they did eventually win the Super Bowl in 1998 and 1999. Not a direct prediction per se, since the Broncos were named in a rerun rather than the original broadcast, but it adds to the lore. More interesting is the prediction about the Saint, Louis Rams. In Sunday Cruddy Sunday, a season 10 episode from 1999, Homer and friends attend the Super Bowl, and the game features the two teams that would eventually play in that year's actual Super Bowl. The episode aired before the season concluded, so the writers were essentially guessing which teams would make it. They got it right. But here's a sports prediction that I think is genuinely one of the best, and it doesn't get talked about nearly enough. In 2010, in Boy Meets Curl, the same episode where Homer and Marge win the curling gold medal, there's also a scene involving another Olympic sport where a competitor is mauled by a polar bear. Now, nobody was mauled by a polar bear at the Olympics, thankfully, but the idea of something going terribly wrong at a Winter Olympics was prescient in a way. The 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi, Russia, were plagued by problems, from unfinished hotel rooms to stray dogs roaming the venues, to the broader political controversy surrounding the games. While nobody encountered a bear, the sense that something chaotic would happen at a future Winter Olympics was on point. And going back to non-sports predictions, let me give you a really good one about academic achievement. Throughout the show's run, Lisa Simpson has been depicted as an extraordinarily gifted student who feels underappreciated and out of place in the public school system. Multiple episodes explore the American education system's failure to nurture exceptional students, the defunding of arts and enrichment programs, and the ways that standardized testing stifles creativity. These themes have become central to the national conversation about education in the 2020s. Debates about standardized testing, school funding, STEM versus humanities education, and the needs of gifted students have intensified. Lisa Simpson has become something of a cultural icon for the frustrated, gifted kid, and the episodes exploring her struggles in the Springfield school system feel more relevant now than when they aired. Let me also spend some time on the show's predictions about media and entertainment, because this is a category that's often overlooked in favor of the flashier political and technological predictions. The Simpsons has consistently depicted a media landscape that is fragmented, sensationalized, and driven by ratings rather than truth. Kent Brockman, the Springfield news anchor, is a perfect parody of the cable news era. He's more concerned with his hair and his ratings than with accurate reporting. The show has featured Fox News parodies, talk radio parodies, reality TV parodies, and social media parodies, all of which have become more and more accurate over time. In one early episode, there's a joke about a 24-hour news channel that runs out of actual news and starts filling airtime with increasingly trivial and manufactured stories. When the episode aired, 24-hour news was still relatively young. CNN had been around since 1980, but the explosion of cable news channels from MSNBC to Fox News was still happening. The idea that these channels would struggle to fill their airtime with substantive content and would resort to manufactured outrage and trivial human interest stories was treated as satire in the 1990s. Today, it's just a description of what most cable news looks like. The show also predicted the rise of reality television in ways that were remarkably specific. In several episodes throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, characters participate in or watch reality shows that feature surveillance, competition, public humiliation, and the exploitation of ordinary people for entertainment. When these episodes aired, reality TV was still in its early stages. Survivor premiered in 2000, and the reality boom was just beginning. But the Simpsons writers could see where it was heading, and their satirical versions of reality shows turned out to be not far off from what eventually flooded the airwaves. There's an episode where the family is featured on a cop-style reality show, and their private moments are broadcast without their consent or understanding. This foreshadowed not just the reality TV boom, but the broader cultural shift towards surveillance entertainment. From dashcam compilations to Ring doorbell footage to TikTok videos of people's most embarrassing moments going viral without their permission. Now, I want to talk about some of the show's predictions about political culture more broadly, because I think this is where The Simpsons' insights are deepest and most enduring. Springfield's political system is a mess. Mayor Quimby is a thinly veiled parody of Ted Kennedy, a corrupt, womanizing politician who stays in power because the alternative is even worse. The city council is incompetent. Public works projects are boondoggles. Lobbyists and special interests run the town. The citizens of Springfield are apathetic, easily manipulated by media, and prone to mob behavior. In the early 1990s, this was considered a somewhat cynical but exaggerated take on American politics. Over the following 3 decades, trust in government institutions has declined dramatically. Voter turnout, while improving in some recent elections, has historically been low. Political polarization has increased to levels not seen since the Civil War era. Corruption scandals, from local city councils to the highest levels of federal government, have become routine. The Simpsons didn't predict specific political events so much as they predicted the trajectory of American political culture. They saw that cynicism, apathy, and institutional decay were growing, and they built a fictional town that embodied those trends. Springfield is America, with the volume turned up a few notches, and the volume in real life has been steadily increasing to match. There's a particular episode that I think captures this perfectly. In Sideshow Bob Roberts, which aired in 1994, Sideshow Bob runs for mayor and wins through voter fraud. The episode explores themes of election manipulation, media complicity, and the fragility of democratic institutions. In 1994, these themes felt like satire. In the 2020s, they feel like a documentary. I should note that I'm not trying to make a political statement here. Whatever your views on elections and democracy, the point is that The Simpsons identified the anxieties around these topics 30 years ago and depicted them in ways that have only become more resonant over time. That's what makes the show's predictions so interesting. They're not about specific events, they're about patterns, and patterns tend to repeat. Let me get into another batch of specific predictions because I know you came here for the specific ones and I've been philosophizing for a bit. Let me get back to the fun stuff. There's a prediction about self-driving cars that I think is worth covering. In multiple episodes throughout the 2000s, characters are shown riding in autonomous vehicles. In one instance, Homer falls asleep at the wheel and the car drives itself. In another, there's a brief scene showing cars navigating traffic without human drivers. These were jokes about Homer's laziness and about the absurdity of technology doing everything for us. But self-driving car technology has been one of the biggest stories in the automotive and tech industries over the past decade. Companies like Tesla, Waymo, and Cruise have invested billions in autonomous vehicle technology. As of right now, self-driving taxis operate in several American cities. The technology isn't perfect, and there are ongoing debates about safety and regulation. But the concept of a car driving itself while the human passenger does something else is no longer science fiction. It's an emerging reality. There's another prediction about food delivery that I find really relevant to modern life. As in various episodes, characters order food and have it delivered almost instantly through futuristic methods. The idea of ordering a meal through a screen and having it show up at your door felt like a luxury or a futuristic fantasy in the 1990s. Today, apps like DoorDash, Uber Eats, and Grubhub have made instant food delivery a multi-billion-dollar industry. The Simpsons version was more dramatic, with food appearing almost magically. But the basic concept of ordering any meal you want from any restaurant and having it show up at your home is now something that billions of people do regularly. There's also a prediction about wearable technology beyond just the smartwatch. In one episode, characters wear glasses that overlay digital information onto the real world. This is essentially augmented reality, which companies like Google explored with Google Glass in 2013, and which Apple has continued to develop with the Vision Pro headset. The idea of wearing a device on your face that adds digital content to your physical environment was a comedy prop in The Simpsons. Now it's a product category that major tech companies are investing billions of dollars into. And here's one that I think will resonate with a lot of people. In a Season 6 episode from 1995, there's a joke about a device that can identify any song playing in the background. You hold it up to the music and it tells you the name of the song. Shazam, the music recognition app, launched in 2002 and became one of the most widely used apps in the world. The Simpsons depicted the concept 7 years before it existed as a product. I could keep going, honestly. The list of things The Simpsons has gotten right, or at least gotten close to right, is genuinely enormous. And new ones keep being added all the time. Every year, some event happens in the real world, and someone finds a Simpsons clip or screenshot that seems to have called it. At this point, it's become a cultural reflex. Something weird happens, and the first question people ask is, did The Simpsons predict this? The answer, more often than you'd expect, is yes, or at least close enough to yes that it makes for a good meme. But what I find most impressive about the whole phenomenon isn't any single prediction. It's the sheer volume and range of topics that the show has managed to touch on. Politics, technology, sports, science, entertainment, food, crime, education, space travel, media, corporate mergers, public health. The Simpsons has made jokes about all of it, and across 800 episodes and 3 decades and counting, a meaningful percentage of those jokes have intersected with real events in ways that feel uncanny. Now let me get into something that I've been wanting to talk about for a while, and it's the psychology behind why we find these predictions so fascinating. Because understanding why our brains latch onto Simpsons predictions actually makes the whole topic richer and more interesting. There's a concept in psychology called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Imagine someone fires a bunch of shots at the side of a barn, and then after the fact, they draw a bullseye around the tightest cluster of bullet holes. It looks like they're an amazing marksman, but they drew the target after shooting. That's essentially what happens with a lot of Simpsons predictions. The show has produced thousands of episodes containing tens of thousands of individual jokes, visual gags, background details, and plot points. After the fact, when something happens in the real world, people go back through this massive library of content and find the moments that line up. They're drawing the bullseye around the bullet holes. This doesn't mean the predictions aren't real. Many of them are genuinely impressive, especially the specific ones like the Trump presidency or the autocorrect gag. But it does mean that the overall number of predictions is inflated by our natural tendency to notice hits and ignore misses. For every Simpsons joke that came true, there are hundreds that didn't. The show has depicted flying cars, teleportation, robot servants, and all sorts of other futuristic technologies that don't exist yet and may never exist. Nobody makes viral posts about those. There's also confirmation bias at play. Once you believe that The Simpsons predicts the future, you start seeing predictions everywhere. A vaguely similar visual? Prediction. A loosely related theme? Prediction. A background detail that kind of sort of resembles something that happened? Prediction. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine, and once it's primed to look for a particular pattern, it finds it even when the connection is tenuous. Snopes, the fact-checking website, has actually investigated numerous claimed Simpsons predictions and found that many of them don't hold up under scrutiny. They've pointed out that some widely shared predictions are actually based on manipulated screenshots, misidentified episodes, or extremely loose interpretations of what the show depicted. The 9/11 one I mentioned earlier is a classic example. The $9 bus advertisement next to the Twin Towers is a coincidence of framing, not a prediction of a terrorist attack. But here's what I find really interesting. Even knowing all of this, even understanding the statistics and the psychology, the genuine predictions are still impressive. Because the Texas sharpshooter fallacy only explains why we overcount the hits. It doesn't explain the hits themselves. When The Simpsons specifically names Donald Trump as a former president 16 years before it happens, that's not a loose interpretation. That's a specific name prediction that came true. When they depict autocorrect failing in exactly the way it would fail on smartphones that didn't exist yet, and Apple engineers use the joke as a development reference, that's not confirmation bias. That's a direct connection between fiction and reality. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in the middle. The Simpsons has made a genuinely impressive number of specific, verifiable predictions. It has also benefited from having such a massive catalog that statistical coincidences are inevitable. And our brains, wired to find patterns and tell stories, have inflated the phenomenon beyond what the evidence strictly supports. But even after you strip away the exaggerations and the false claims, what remains is remarkable. Let me get back to specific predictions now, because there are still quite a few I want to cover. Here's one that involves the world of finance and technology intersecting in a way that would have seemed completely insane in the 1990s. In several episodes, characters are shown engaging in online transactions and e-commerce in ways that anticipated the rise of platforms like Amazon and eBay. In one episode from the late 1990s, Homer gets addicted to online shopping, ordering item after item through his computer and having them delivered to his door. The packages pile up, the credit card bills mount. Marge is horrified. At the time, online shopping was in its infancy. Amazon had only been selling books for a few years. The idea that someone would do most of their shopping online from their couch and have everything delivered was still novel. Today, it's the default for millions of people. The pandemic accelerated this trend dramatically, with online retail growing by years' worth of projected growth in a matter of months during 2020 and 2021. Homer's compulsive online shopping, played for laughs in the late 90s, is now just a normal Tuesday for a huge percentage of the population. There's another financial prediction that I think is worth talking about because it involves a specific type of fraud. In The Ziff Who Came to Dinner, the same episode with the Matrix 4 poster, the plot revolves around Artie Ziff, who ran a tech company that collapsed amid fraud allegations. Artie is hiding in the Simpsons attic because his company went under and he's being investigated by the SEC. The episode aired in 2004. Now think about what happened in the years following. The 2008 financial crisis was driven in part by corporate fraud, reckless financial engineering, and a lack of regulatory oversight. Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme was exposed that same year. In the 2010s and 2020s, tech company fraud became its own category, with cases like Theranos, WeWork, and FTX making headlines. Elizabeth Holmes built a multi-billion-dollar company on fraudulent claims about blood testing technology. Sam Bankman-Fried's FTX cryptocurrency exchange collapsed in spectacular fashion amid allegations of fraud and misuse of customer funds. The Simpsons didn't predict any of these specific cases, but the archetype they created with Artie Ziff, a charismatic tech founder whose company is built on lies and who tries to escape the consequences, has been replicated in real life so many times that it's become a recognizable pattern. The show identified the archetype before it became a recurring feature of American business culture. Speaking of technology companies, let me mention a prediction about streaming that I think is particularly clever. Throughout its run, The Simpsons has made numerous jokes about the future of television. Characters have been shown watching TV on various devices, from wall-mounted screens to tablets to holographic displays. But more importantly, the show has consistently depicted a future where traditional television is fragmented into hundreds of niche channels and on-demand services. In one episode from the early 2000s, there's a gag where Homer scrolls through an impossibly long list of TV channels, each one more specific and absurd than the last. The joke was about the proliferation of cable channels, but what actually happened was even more extreme than the joke. We didn't just get hundreds of cable channels, we got streaming services, Netflix, Hulu, Disney+, Amazon Prime, HBO Max, Peacock, Paramount+, Apple TV+, and dozens more. The fragmentation of television that The Simpsons was joking about in the early 2000s has become one of the defining features of modern entertainment. And here's the kicker. The Simpsons itself is now part of that fragmented landscape. The show airs on Fox, streams on Disney+ and Hulu, and is available for purchase on multiple digital platforms. It's a relic of the broadcast era that has successfully transitioned into the streaming era, which is something that the writers have joked about in recent seasons. The show that predicted the death of traditional TV is one of the last traditional TV shows still standing. Let me talk about one more prediction in this section that I find genuinely unsettling. Not in a supernatural way, but in a wow, they really saw this coming way. In multiple episodes throughout the 2000s and 2010s, The Simpsons depicted scenarios where misinformation spreads rapidly through a community, causing panic, division, and irrational behavior. Springfield citizens believe false rumors, react to manufactured crises, and are manipulated by people who benefit from their confusion. The show has consistently portrayed the Springfield public as gullible, easily swayed by fear, and prone to acting on bad information. In the 2020s, misinformation has become one of the most pressing issues facing democratic societies worldwide. The spread of false information about COVID vaccines, election integrity, climate change, and countless other topics has had tangible, measurable consequences. Social media platforms have struggled to contain it. Governments have debated how to regulate it. And ordinary people have found themselves navigating an information environment where truth and fiction are increasingly difficult to distinguish. The Simpsons didn't predict misinformation. Misinformation has existed as long as humans have communicated with each other. But the show captured something about the vulnerability of communities to false information and the ease with which bad actors can exploit that vulnerability that has only become more relevant as technology has amplified both the speed and reach of false claims. Now here's a lighter one to balance things out. In King Size Homer, a season 7 episode from 1995, Homer deliberately gains weight so he can qualify as disabled and work from home. He reaches 300 pounds, gets to wear a muumuu, and telecommutes from his couch. The work from home angle is what makes this feel predictive in hindsight. When the episode aired, working from home was rare and generally limited to specific professions. The idea of a nuclear plant worker doing his job from his living room was absurd. But the COVID pandemic forced millions of workers into remote work arrangements, and many companies discovered that employees could be just as productive, or in Homer's case, just as unproductive from home as they were in the office. The remote work revolution that began in 2020 has permanently changed how many Americans work, and Homer Simpson was ahead of the curve by 25 years. There's also a great prediction about social media influencer culture buried in various episodes. In Bart Gets Famous, a season 5 episode from 1994, Bart becomes a minor celebrity by repeating the catchphrase, "I didn't do it," on Krusty's show. He gets endorsement deals, makes talk show appearances, and becomes briefly famous for doing essentially nothing of substance. When the catchphrase gets old, his fame evaporates instantly. This is a remarkably accurate preview of how internet fame works in the 2020s. People go viral for a catchphrase, a moment, a clip. They get brand deals and interview requests. And then, as quickly as it started, the attention moves on to the next thing. The cycle of viral fame and rapid obscurity that defines so much of social media culture was captured by The Simpsons in 1994, more than a decade before YouTube existed and 2 decades before TikTok. In Homer and Apu, a season 5 episode from 1994, there's a hidden camera investigation that exposes unsanitary practices at the Quickie Mart. This foreshadowed the hidden camera investigation genre that would become a staple of both journalism and reality television in the 2000s and 2010s. Shows like Undercover Boss, investigative programs using hidden cameras, and YouTube channels dedicated to catching businesses in the act of wrongdoing all echo the premise of this episode. And then there's the prediction about competitive eating that I want to come back to with a bit more detail. In 1996, Homer Palooza features Homer surviving cannonball shots to the stomach as a sideshow act. While this isn't competitive eating exactly, the celebration of extreme physical feats involving the human stomach anticipated the rise of competitive eating as a televised sport. Nathan's famous hot dog eating contest went from a quirky Coney Island tradition to an ESPN broadcast event. Joey Chestnut became a household name. Competitive eating went from a punchline to a legitimate athletic pursuit, sort of. And The Simpsons was riffing on the absurdity of turning the human body into entertainment decades before it became mainstream. I want to take a bit of a detour here and talk about something that I think adds a lot of richness to this whole conversation, and that's the psychology behind why we find Simpsons predictions so fascinating in the first place. Because understanding why our brains respond to these the way they do actually makes the genuine predictions even more impressive. There's a concept in psychology called apophenia, which is the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. It's the reason people see faces in clouds, patterns in random noise, and messages in songs played backwards. Our brains are pattern recognition machines. They're constantly scanning the environment for meaningful information, and sometimes they find meaning where there isn't any. This is a survival mechanism. In the wild, the ancestor who saw a pattern in the rustling grass and assumed it might be a predator survived more often than the ancestor who assumed it was just the wind. We're descended from the paranoid ones, basically. When it comes to Simpsons predictions, apophenia is working overtime. You've got a show with over 800 episodes, each one packed with dozens of visual gags, background details, dialogue jokes, and plot points. That's tens of thousands of individual pieces of content. On the other side, you got the entire span of human events from 1989 to the present. Decades of political events, technological developments, cultural shifts, sports outcomes, celebrity scandals, natural disasters, and everything else that has happened in the world. When you have that much content on one side and that much reality on the other, some overlaps are statistically inevitable. It would actually be remarkable if nothing in The Simpsons had ever corresponded to a real-world event. The sheer volume of content guarantees coincidences, and our pattern-seeking brains are primed to notice and remember the hits while ignoring the thousands and thousands of misses. This is what psychologists call confirmation bias. We remember the time The Simpsons predicted Trump's presidency. We don't remember the hundreds of future set episodes and gags that depicted things that never happened and probably never will. Nobody makes a viral meme about the time The Simpsons showed a thing that didn't come true because that's not interesting. The hits get shared and reshared. The misses disappear. And over time, this creates the impression that the show has some kind of supernatural track record, when in reality, it has the same hit rate as any other prolific piece of media that references current events and imagines possible futures. Snopes, the fact-checking website, has made this point repeatedly. They've investigated dozens of claimed Simpsons predictions and found that many of them are either exaggerated, taken out of context, or based on loose interpretations that require squinting to see the connection. Some claim predictions are outright fabricated, with fake screenshots created by internet users and attributed to the show. But here's the thing, and this is what I keep coming back to. Even after you account for confirmation bias, apophenia, and statistical inevitability, there's still a residue of predictions that are genuinely impressive. The Trump presidency wasn't a vague reference. It was a specific mention of President Trump in the year 2000. The Disney-Fox merger wasn't an ambiguous visual. It was a literal sign reading, "A division of Walt Disney Company." The autocorrect gag didn't just predict the concept. It influenced the development of the actual technology. These aren't coincidences that require interpretation. They're specific, documented, and verifiable. And when you combine them with the academic caliber of the writing staff, the show's deliberate engagement with current trends, and the writer's own explanations of how they come up with their material, what emerges is a picture of a show that is genuinely, measurably better at anticipating the future than random chance would suggest. It's not magic. It's not time travel. It's intelligence, volume, and cultural engagement producing results that occasionally cross the line from satire into prophecy. And I think that's more interesting than if the writers actually were psychic, because it means the future isn't as unpredictable as we think it is. If a group of comedy writers in Los Angeles can look at the world in 1998 and see the Disney-Fox merger coming, or look at the world in 2000 and see a Trump presidency as a plausible scenario, then maybe the future is less about random chance and more about the logical consequences of present-day trends. That's a comforting thought in some ways and a scary one in others. Comforting because it means smart people can anticipate what's coming. Scary because it means some of the problems we're facing were visible decades ago, and we still didn't do anything about them. Okay, let me get back to the predictions themselves because I've got more to cover, and this is supposed to be the fun part. There's a really entertaining cluster of predictions that involve specific products and brands, and I want to run through a few of them because they show how granular the show's predictions can get. In 2005, there is an episode where Homer is seen using a machine that looks remarkably like a modern self-checkout kiosk at a grocery store. Self-checkout technology existed in limited form by 2005, with the first machines appearing in the late 1990s, but they were still relatively uncommon and most people hadn't encountered one. Today, self-checkout is ubiquitous. Nearly every major grocery store and retailer has them, and in some stores they've almost entirely replaced human cashiers. The Simpsons depicted Homer interacting with automated retail technology in a way that anticipated how most of us shop today. In multiple episodes, characters are shown interacting with large flat-screen televisions mounted on walls. In the early to mid-1990s, when many of these episodes aired, most Americans had bulky CRT televisions. Flat screens existed in prototype form but were extremely expensive and not widely available. The Simpsons consistently depicted flat-screen TVs as a normal part of home life, and by the late 2000s, that's exactly what they became. There's also a prediction about drone delivery that appears in later episodes. Characters receive packages delivered by flying devices, which was treated as a futuristic convenience. Amazon announced its Prime Air Drone delivery service in 2013, and while the technology has been slower to roll out than initially promised, drone delivery is now operational in several markets. Walmart, Wing, and other companies have also launched drone delivery services. The concept of a flying robot bringing you a package, which was science fiction in The Simpsons, is now available to millions of people. Now, here's one that I find particularly funny because it involves a very specific consumer trend. In a 1998 episode, there's a gag about bottled water being marketed as a premium luxury product. Characters are shown paying inflated prices for water that's no different from tap water, and the whole thing is presented as ridiculous. In 1998, the bottled water industry was already growing, but it hadn't yet reached the absurd heights it would hit in the 2000s and 2010s. Brands like Fiji, Voss, and various artisanal water companies have since turned water, the most basic substance on Earth, into a multi-billion-dollar premium product. People pay $5, $10, even $20 for water in designer bottles at restaurants and shops. Lisa's wedding even included a joke about complimentary water with only a hint of lime, anticipating the flavored and enhanced water market that exploded in the 2000s. The Simpsons saw what was happening with consumer culture, the tendency to take basic commodities and rebrand them as luxury goods, and pushed it to what they thought was a comedic extreme. The real world caught up and in some cases surpassed the joke. Let me mention a few more rapid-fire predictions before we move into the home stretch of this video. because some of these smaller ones are genuinely delightful. There's a 1999 episode where Homer accidentally ruins a football game by running onto the field, and the incident is captured by dozens of fans holding up small handheld recording devices. In 1999, the idea of an entire stadium full of people recording events on personal devices was far-fetched. Camera phones barely existed. The first camera phone was released in 2000, and early models took terrible photos. But today, every major event is captured by thousands of smartphones. The image of a crowd all holding up their phones to record is one of the defining visuals of the 21st century, and The Simpsons depicted it before it was even possible. There's an episode where Springfield installs red light cameras at intersections, leading to controversy about surveillance and privacy. Red light cameras and speed cameras have since become common in cities across America and around the world, and they've generated exactly the kind of privacy and surveillance debates that the episode depicted. In a 2001 episode, there's a brief gag about a restaurant that serves only locally sourced, organic food at ridiculously high prices. The farm-to-table movement and the explosion of organic, locally sourced restaurants in the 2000s turned this joke into a description of a very real and very profitable segment of the food industry. And there's one that I think is perfect for this stage of the video. In Homer the Heretic, a 1992 episode where Homer decides to skip church and stay home, he creates what he describes as the perfect day. He stays in his pajamas, watches TV, makes snacks, and doesn't leave the house. He calls it heaven. This was meant to be a commentary on laziness and the conflict between spiritual obligation and personal comfort. But in 2020, when millions of people were confined to their homes during lockdown, Homer's perfect day became something that a lot of people could relate to on a very personal level. Staying home in pajamas, watching TV, making snacks, and not going anywhere wasn't laziness anymore. It was public health policy. Homer Simpson was living the quarantine lifestyle 28 years before the rest of us had to. Now, I also want to acknowledge something that I think is important for the integrity of this whole discussion. Not every claimed Simpsons prediction is real, and some of the most viral ones are actually completely fabricated. There are fake Simpsons screenshots all over the internet. People create images that look like they're from episodes of the show, but which were never actually aired. These get shared on social media, go viral, and become part of the Simpsons predicted it legend, even though they're entirely made up. During the COVID pandemic, several fake Simpsons screenshots circulated showing characters wearing masks or referencing a coronavirus by name. These were not from real episodes. They were created by internet users looking to capitalize on the prediction meme. Similarly, some claim predictions are based on misidentified episodes, incorrect dates, or deliberate misrepresentation. People will take a screenshot from a 2015 episode and claim it's from 1995 to make the prediction seem more impressive, or they'll describe an episode in a way that exaggerates the similarities to a real event. This kind of thing muddies the waters and makes it harder to appreciate the genuine predictions. That's actually one of the reasons I wanted to make this video, because I think the real predictions, the documented, verifiable ones from actual episodes with known air dates, are impressive enough on their own. They don't need embellishment. And by separating the wheat from the chaff, by being honest about which ones are stretches and which ones are the real deal, I think we can appreciate the genuine phenomenon for what it is. Let me get into one more substantial prediction section before we start wrapping up, because there's a whole category we haven't fully explored yet, and that's predictions about the environment and climate. The Simpsons has been making environmental jokes since its earliest seasons. The Springfield nuclear power plant, run by the cartoonishly evil Mr. Burns, is a constant source of pollution, radiation, and ecological disaster. Blinky the three-eyed fish is the most famous example, but the show is filled with references to polluted water, toxic waste, smog, and environmental degradation. In Trash of the Titans, which aired in 1998 as the show's 200th episode, Homer becomes the sanitation commissioner of Springfield and promises the citizens that they'll never have to deal with their own garbage again. He outsources waste management to a system that basically involves stuffing trash underground, which eventually causes the entire town to be built on a foundation of garbage that becomes unstable. The episode ends with the town literally moving to escape the pollution. This episode has been cited as predictive of several real-world environmental crises. The growing problem of landfill capacity in the United States, the discovery of toxic waste sites underneath residential areas, and the broader issue of unsustainable waste management practices have all made Trash of the Titans feel more relevant over time. The global recycling crisis, particularly after China stopped accepting the world's recyclable materials in 2018, added another layer. The idea that we can't just make our garbage someone else's problem, which is the central theme of the episode, is now a mainstream environmental concern. There's also the show's consistent engagement with climate change. While The Simpsons has never done a single definitive climate change episode, the show has referenced rising temperatures, extreme weather, and environmental collapse in numerous episodes across its run. Springfield has experienced bizarre weather patterns, environmental disasters, and ecological disruptions that parallel real-world trends. In The Old Man and the Key, a 2002 episode, there's a brief reference to glaciers melting. In the early 2000s, public awareness of climate change was growing, but the issue hadn't yet reached the mainstream urgency it has today. The show's casual references to melting ice and environmental degradation anticipated the images of collapsing ice shelves and shrinking glaciers that would become central to the climate conversation in the 2000s and 2000s. And speaking of environmental predictions, there's one more that I want to spend time on because I think it ties together a lot of what we've been talking about. In Lisa the Vegetarian, which aired in 1995, Lisa decides to stop eating meat after bonding with a lamb at a petting zoo. The episode explores the tension between her personal ethics and the social pressure to conform to her family's meat-eating habits. It features Paul and Linda McCartney as guest stars, and Paul agreed to appear on the condition that Lisa would remain a vegetarian for the rest of the show's run, which the writers agreed to and have honored ever since. In 1995, vegetarianism was niche. It existed, obviously, but it wasn't mainstream in the way it would become in the 2000s and 10s and 2000s and 20s. Plant-based diets, veganism, flexitarianism, and the broader movement toward reducing meat consumption for environmental and ethical reasons have become major cultural trends. Companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods have turned plant-based alternatives into a multi-billion-dollar industry. The environmental impact of animal agriculture has become a central part of the climate conversation. And Lisa Simpson, who went vegetarian in 1995, has been quietly ahead of that curve for 3 decades. The episode doesn't predict any specific event, but it captures the early stirrings of a cultural shift that would take decades to fully materialize. The writers saw that attitudes toward meat consumption were beginning to change, and they used Lisa, their most forward-thinking character, to embody that change. 30 years later, Lisa's vegetarianism isn't a quirky character trait anymore. It's a lifestyle choice shared by millions of people worldwide. There's also an environmental prediction that involves the ocean specifically. In various episodes, the waters around Springfield are depicted as polluted, filled with garbage, and home to mutated sea life. Lake Springfield in particular is shown as a toxic dumping ground. In the Simpsons movie, the pollution of Lake Springfield becomes the central plot point when Homer dumps a silo of pig waste into the lake, triggering an environmental catastrophe that leads the EPA to literally seal the town under a dome. The movie came out in 2007. Since then, real-world concerns about water pollution have only intensified. The Flint, Michigan water crisis, which came to national attention in 2014 and 2015, revealed that an entire American city had been exposed to lead-contaminated water due to government negligence. Ocean garbage patches, including the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, have become major news stories. Microplastics have been found in virtually every body of water on Earth, as well as in human blood and breast milk. The idea that our water is more polluted and more endangered than we realize, which The Simpsons has been depicting since its earliest seasons, is now supported by overwhelming scientific evidence. All right, I think we've covered enough individual predictions to give you a real sense of the scope and variety of what this show has gotten right. But before I wrap things up, I want to spend some time on why. Why does The Simpsons keep getting things right? What is it about this particular show with these particular writers airing on this particular network that produces so many seemingly prophetic moments? I've touched on some of these reasons throughout the video, but I want to pull them all together now because I think the explanation is actually more interesting than the predictions themselves. The first reason is volume. This is the one that Al Jean always points to, and he's right. Over 800 episodes, 37 seasons, tens of thousands of jokes, visual gags, background details, and plot points. When you produce that much content over that long a period, you're going to hit some bullseyes. It's math, plain and simple. If I made 10,000 predictions about the future, some of them would come true, and then people would call me a prophet while ignoring the 9,900 that missed. The Simpsons has the largest content library of any scripted show in American television history. That library is going to contain coincidences. Lots of them. But volume alone doesn't explain it, because other long-running shows don't have the same prediction track record. Saturday Night Live has been on since 1975 and has produced thousands of sketches, but nobody talks about SNL predicting the future. Law and Order has hundreds of episodes, many ripped from the headlines, but that's not the same as prediction. What makes The Simpsons different isn't just how much content it produces. It's the kind of content it produces. And that brings us to the second reason, which is the intelligence and education of the writing staff. I've talked about this a lot already, but I really can't overstate it. The Simpsons writers' room is one of the most intellectually formidable collections of creative talent in entertainment history. Harvard mathematicians, Princeton computer scientists, physics PhDs, political science experts, voracious readers, and deeply curious people who pay close attention to the world around them. These aren't people who are making random jokes. They're people who understand trends, systems, and the logic of how things evolve. When Al Jean writes a joke about technology, he's drawing on a deep understanding of mathematics and how computational trends progress. When David X. Cohen writes a Higgs boson equation, he's consulting with physicists and using real data. When Dan Graney writes about President Trump, he's observing the political landscape and identifying the most absurd, plausible scenario. The writers aren't guessing, they're analyzing, and sometimes their analysis turns out to be correct. The third reason is the show's commitment to satire through extrapolation. The fundamental creative method of The Simpsons is to take something real and push it to its funniest logical extreme. Homer works at a nuclear plant. The plant is comically dangerous and poorly managed. America has a celebrity-obsessed culture. A celebrity becomes president. Technology is getting smaller and more personal. People wear computers on their wrists. Food supply chains are going global. A virus spreads through a juicer from Japan. This method of comedy, taking a real trend and asking what's the most ridiculous version of where this is going, is essentially scenario planning with a punchline. And here's the thing about scenario planning. Sometimes the ridiculous version actually happens. Because the writers are starting from real data and following real logic, just push further than most people would take it. They sometimes arrive at conclusions that the rest of the world reaches years or decades later. Bill Oakley, one of the show's most important early writers, explained it this way. He said that there are very few cases where The Simpsons actually predicted something, and that it's mainly just coincidence because the episodes are so old that history ends up repeating itself. But I think he's being modest. It's not just that history repeats itself. It's that the writers were observing the conditions that make history repeat, and they were flagging those conditions through comedy. They weren't predicting specific events. They were identifying patterns, and patterns by definition repeat. The fourth reason is what I've been calling the cultural feedback loop. This is the idea that The Simpsons doesn't just predict the future, it helps create it. When Cypress Hill performs with the London Symphony Orchestra, the Simpsons joke is part of the reason it happens. When Apple engineers work to avoid the Eat Up Martha problem, the Simpsons gag is influencing real product development. When Rob Bauer grows tobacco in Oregon, the Simpsons episode is the direct inspiration. The show is so deeply embedded in popular culture that it functions as a kind of idea generator. It puts concepts out into the world, and some of those concepts take on a life of their own. People see a Simpsons episode and think, wait, that's actually a good idea, or wouldn't it be funny if that actually happened, or I wonder if I could actually make that work. And then they go and do it. The prediction becomes self-fulfilling, not because the writers saw the future, but because the writers influenced it. The fifth and final reason is the most mundane, but maybe the most important, and that's the breadth of topics the show covers. The Simpsons isn't a show about one thing. It's a show about everything: politics, science, sports, technology, entertainment, food, education, religion, crime, media, the environment, space, art, music, literature, history, philosophy. Every aspect of human life has been the subject of a Simpsons episode at some point. The show's topical range is virtually unlimited. This matters because prediction is a numbers game in two dimensions. You need volume, which we've covered, and you need variety. If The Simpsons only made jokes about politics, it would only occasionally predict political events. But because it makes jokes about everything, it has the opportunity to predict things in every domain of human activity. And it does. Politics, technology, sports, corporate mergers, food scandals, scientific discoveries, cultural trends. The predictions span the entire breadth of human experience because the show does too. When you combine all 5 of these factors, volume, intelligence, extrapolation, cultural influence, and topical breadth, you get a show that is uniquely positioned to produce seemingly prophetic content. No other show in television history checks all 5 boxes. That's why The Simpsons keeps getting things right when other long-running shows don't. It's not one factor. It's the combination. And here's what I think is the most important thing to take away from all of this. The Simpsons predictions aren't evidence that the future is predetermined or that the writers have supernatural abilities. They're evidence that the future is more predictable than we think if you're paying close enough attention. The trends that produce tomorrow's headlines are visible today if you know where to look and how to extrapolate. The Simpsons writers have been doing this for over 3 decades, and their track record speaks for itself. It's also worth noting that the show gets things wrong far more often than it gets things right. For every President Trump, there are dozens of future scenarios that never materialized. For every 3-eyed fish near a nuclear plant, there are hundreds of background gags that remain firmly fictional. The hits are memorable precisely because they're rare enough to be surprising. If the show predicted everything correctly, it wouldn't be impressive. It would be terrifying. Before I start wrapping things up, though, I realize there are a handful of predictions I haven't touched on yet that I think are too good to skip. And honestly, the more I researched this topic, the more I kept finding. So consider this a final batch before we head for the exit. There's a really entertaining one about Greece and the Olympic flame. In the episode The Bart Wants What It Wants, which aired in 2002, there's a brief throwaway gag involving the Olympics and the idea that the traditions surrounding the games might get increasingly commercialized and politicized. While it wasn't a direct prediction of any specific event, the 2004 Athens Olympics, which returned the games to Greece for the first time in over a century, were indeed marred by construction delays, budget overruns, and controversy about whether the venues would even be ready in time. Greece spent an estimated 9 billion euros on those games, and many economists have argued that the financial strain contributed to the debt crisis that would nearly destroy the country a few years later. The Simpsons was already joking about Greece's financial fragility 2 years before the Olympic spending spree began. There's another one involving cruise ships that I think resonates with a lot of people. In Bart's Girlfriend, a 1994 episode, there's a background scene showing a cruise ship in a less than flattering light, with the implication that these massive floating hotels aren't quite as glamorous as they seem. Fast forward to the 2010s and 2020s, and cruise ships have been in the news for all the wrong reasons. Norovirus outbreaks, the Costa Concordia disaster in 2012, the Diamond Princess being quarantined during COVID in 2020, ongoing environmental concerns about dumping and emissions. The romantic image of cruise travel that dominated for decades has been significantly tarnished, and The Simpsons' skeptical take on the industry looks prescient. Let me also mention a prediction about the gig economy and the changing nature of work. In various episodes throughout its run, Homer has held dozens of different jobs. Literally dozens. There's a running joke about how many careers Homer has had, from astronaut to food critic to monorail conductor to snowplow driver to professional musician to grease salesman. The joke is that he can never hold down a steady career and bounces from one thing to the next. In the 1990s, this was played as a character flaw. Homer was irresponsible and couldn't commit. But in the 2020s, the idea of someone having multiple careers, doing gig work, freelancing, and constantly shifting between different types of employment is no longer unusual. The gig economy has fundamentally changed the relationship between workers and employers. Millions of people now work multiple jobs, drive for rideshare companies, deliver food, freelance online, and piece together incomes from various sources. Homer wasn't irresponsible. He was just 30 years ahead of the labor market. There's a prediction about streaming services that I want to mention as well. In multiple episodes from the 2000s, characters are shown watching content on demand through various devices, choosing what they want to watch whenever they want to watch it. The idea of on-demand entertainment was still novel during the era of DVDs and cable television. Netflix didn't launch its streaming service until 2007, and it took several more years for streaming to become the dominant way people consume media. But The Simpsons depicted the basic concept of choosing and watching content on your own schedule through a screen years before it became the norm. And here's one that combines technology with social behavior in a way I find really insightful. In a 2005 episode, Marge becomes addicted to an online game. She starts playing compulsively, neglects her family, loses track of time, and essentially becomes consumed by the digital world. The episode was a commentary on the addictive potential of video games and online entertainment. In 2005, gaming addiction was a concern but wasn't widely recognized as a serious clinical issue. In 2018, the World Health Organization officially added gaming disorder to its international classification of diseases. Screen addiction, social media addiction, and the broader phenomenon of compulsive technology use have become major public health conversations. The Simpsons depicted the problem in comedic terms 13 years before the medical establishment formally recognized it. There's one more that I want to give proper attention to, and it involves the intersection of sports and technology. In Sunday Cruddy. Sunday, the 1999 Super Bowl episode I mentioned earlier, there's a scene where the characters are watching the game on a massive screen that shows replays from multiple angles, with graphics overlaying real-time statistics. In 1999, sports broadcasts were significantly simpler than they are today. The idea of augmented reality graphics during live sports, real-time statistical overlays, and multi-angle instant replays was still in its early stages. Today, watching a football game involves an overwhelming amount of technological enhancement. First down lines that don't actually exist are projected onto the field. Player tracking data is shown in real time. Broadcasts cut to dozens of camera angles within seconds of a play. Fantasy football statistics scroll across the bottom of the screen. Virtual advertising changes depending on what market you're in. The modern sports viewing experience is exactly the kind of technology-enhanced spectacle that The Simpsons was imagining in 1999. And since we're talking about the intersection of media and technology, let me mention one final prediction that I think encapsulates the entire phenomenon. In 2007, there's a scene where Homer records a video of himself doing something stupid and it goes viral online. The video spreads from person to person, gets remixed and parodied, and Homer briefly becomes an internet celebrity before the attention fades and moves on to the next thing. In 2007, YouTube was only 2 years old. Viral videos existed, but the infrastructure for something to go viral in the way we understand it today was still being built. The idea of a regular person filming themselves, uploading it, and becoming famous overnight was novel and slightly weird. Today, it's the foundation of an entire economy. TikTok, YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, the entire short-form video ecosystem is built on the premise that anyone can film anything and potentially reach millions of people. Homer's viral moment in 2007 was a joke about a trend that was just beginning. Today, it's a description of how hundreds of millions of people interact with media every day. What ties all of these predictions together, from the political ones to the technological ones to the cultural ones, is the same fundamental insight. The Simpsons understands people. It understands what motivates us, what scares us, what entertains us, what tempts us, and what we'll do when given new tools and new freedoms. The specific technologies and events change, but the human behaviors driving them don't. And because the show has been observing and cataloging those behaviors for over 3 decades, Its archive of observations keeps intersecting with new expressions of the same old patterns. Greed doesn't change. Curiosity doesn't change. Laziness doesn't change. The desire for connection, the fear of being left behind, the impulse to take shortcuts, the tendency to ignore problems until they become crises, these are constants. And The Simpsons has been documenting them with more precision and wit than virtually any other work of art in history. That's ultimately why the show keeps predicting the future. Not because the future is predetermined, and not because the writers are secret time travelers, but because human nature doesn't change, and a show that understands human nature deeply enough will inevitably anticipate where that nature leads us next. The details are different. Nobody in 1995 could have told you the name of the specific smartwatch that Apple would release 20 years later. Nobody in 2000 could have told you the exact year Trump would win. But the trajectories, the directions, the arcs, those were visible to anyone paying close enough attention. And The Simpsons writers were paying closer attention than almost anyone. That, more than any single episode or screenshot or side-by-side comparison, is what makes The Simpsons prediction phenomenon worth talking about. It's a testament to what happens when very smart people spend decades observing the world and expressing what they see through the lens of comedy. The future isn't hidden. It's just funnier than we expect. So the real lesson of The Simpsons prediction phenomenon isn't that a cartoon can see the future. It's that the future leaves clues, and if you're smart enough, curious enough, and productive enough, you can pick up on those clues and project them forward. The Simpsons writers have been doing this for 37 seasons, and they've gotten remarkably good at it. Not because they're psychic, but because they're brilliant. Now, before I start wrapping this up properly, I want to squeeze in a few more predictions that I've been saving, because some of these are too good to leave on the cutting room floor, and I think they're the perfect way to round out this conversation. There's one from Homer versus the 18th Amendment, which aired in 1997. In the episode, Springfield enacts a prohibition on alcohol, and Homer becomes a bootlegger. The episode is a parody of Prohibition-era America. But there's a scene where Homer develops an elaborate underground network for distributing illegal beer. He hides the beer in bowling balls, in baby carriages, and all sorts of creative contraptions. The creativity of the smuggling methods is played for laughs. In the years since, the real-world drug trade has produced smuggling methods that are every bit as creative and absurd as Homer's schemes. Drugs hidden in shipments of bananas, in the hulls of submarines, and hollowed-out pineapples and children's toys. The creativity of real smugglers has consistently matched or exceeded the imagination of the Simpsons writers. The episode wasn't predicting any specific smuggling operation, but it captured the truth that prohibition of any substance tends to produce extraordinarily creative criminal enterprise. That's not prediction. That's just understanding human nature. There's also a fun one involving the internet itself. In Das Bus, a 1998 episode, Homer starts an internet company called Compu Global Hyper Meganet. It's a parody of the dot-com bubble, which was in full swing at the time. Homer's company does essentially nothing but somehow attracts investment and attention because it has the word internet in its name. The joke was about how anyone could start an internet company in the late 90s and attract money regardless of whether the business had a viable product or plan. This was satire of something that was already happening, but it also predicted how the cycle would repeat itself. The dot-com bubble burst in 2000, but by the 2010s, a similar dynamic was playing out with tech startups. Companies with vague business models and catchy names were attracting billions in venture capital funding. The WeWork saga, Theranos, and various cryptocurrency ventures all echoed the throw money at anything with a tech veneer mentality that Homer's Compu Global Hyper Meganet was parodying. The specific companies change, but the pattern of irrational exuberance in the tech sector is apparently eternal. And The Simpsons nailed it. And then there's a small prediction that I find weirdly charming. In a 1998 episode, there's a scene at Springfield Elementary where a poster on the wall shows a tiger with the caption, "Hang in there." This is a parody of the ubiquitous motivational posters that was a staple of offices and classrooms in the 80s and 90s, usually featuring a kitten dangling from a branch. The Simpsons version was a gently mocking comment on the emptiness of corporate motivation. In the 2010s and 2020s, The culture around corporate motivation and wellness has exploded into something that the original motivational poster makers could never have imagined. We now have mindfulness apps, corporate wellness programs, mandatory fun at work, and an entire industry built around the idea that you can poster and podcast your way to happiness. The original Hang In There poster was innocent and a little cheesy. The modern version of corporate motivation is a multi-billion-dollar industry that The Simpsons was already side-eyeing in 1998. Let me also circle back one final time to the idea of predictions about the show itself, because there's one more meta-prediction that I think is the perfect capstone. Throughout its run, characters on The Simpsons have repeatedly joked that the show will never end. There are references to the show running for hundreds of episodes, to the characters never aging, to the fact that Springfield exists in a kind of temporal bubble where years pass but nothing fundamentally changes. Homer is always around 36 to 39 years old. Bart is always 10. Lisa is always 8. Maggie is always a baby. The show exists outside of time. In the mid-2000s, when the show was around its 15th season, there was a genuine expectation that it would end soon. Ratings were declining. Critics were saying the golden age was over. People assumed it was only a matter of time before Fox pulled the plug. But the show just kept going. Season 20 came and went. Season 25, Season 30, Season 35, and now it's been renewed through Season 40. The joke about the show never ending has become the most accurate prediction of all. The Simpsons will outlast most of us. It will certainly outlast most of the shows that have tried to replace it. It has become, in a very real sense, a permanent fixture of American culture, as enduring as the cultural institutions it satirizes. The writers predicted their own immortality, and for once, the joke isn't funny because it's absurd. It's funny because it's true. And you know what? I think there's something beautiful about that. A show that started as a series of crude animated shorts on the Tracy Ullman Show in 1987, created by a guy who was basically doodling in the waiting room before a meeting, has become one of the most important cultural documents of the last 4 decades. It's outlasted the Soviet Union. It's outlasted Blockbuster Video. It's outlasted the Twin Towers. It predated the World Wide Web, and it's still going in the age of artificial intelligence. Whatever else you want to say about The Simpsons, whatever your opinion on the quality of recent seasons versus the Golden Age, the sheer persistence and cultural weight of this show is something that has no parallel in entertainment history. And the predictions are, in a way, a reflection of that persistence. When a show has been around long enough to comment on every aspect of human civilization across 4 decades, when it's staffed by some of the smartest comedic minds of multiple generations, when it's been watched by literally billions of people worldwide, it becomes more than a TV show. It becomes a cultural record, a living archive of what we were worried about, what we were laughing at, what we were dreaming about, and what we were afraid of, decade by decade, year by year. The predictions aren't accidents. They're artifacts of a show that has been paying closer attention to the world than almost any other creative work in history. And the fact that we keep discovering new ones, that every year brings new events that correspond to old episodes, is proof that the show's observations were sharp enough to remain relevant long after the laugh track faded. So where does that leave us? After 3 hours of talking about a cartoon's track record of seeing the future, what's the takeaway? I think there are a few. First, the future is less random than we think it is. Trends leave fingerprints. If you understand politics, technology, human behavior, and cultural dynamics well enough, you can make educated guesses about where things are heading. The Simpsons writers do this instinctively as part of their creative process, and their success rate suggests that the method works. Second, intelligence and curiosity are superpowers when it comes to understanding the world. The reason the Simpsons writers are so good at this isn't talent alone. It's the combination of talent and deep, genuine engagement with the world. They read everything. They follow the news obsessively. They argue about trends and ideas in the writer's room. They consult experts when they need to. They take their comedy seriously, even when the comedy itself is silly. That intellectual rigor is what separates a Simpsons background gag from random noise. Third, art shapes the world as much as it reflects it. The Simpsons doesn't just predict the future. It participates in creating it. Through cultural influence, through idea generation, through the feedback loop between fiction and reality, the show is an active participant in the unfolding of events, not just a passive observer. When we watch The Simpsons, we're not just consuming entertainment. We're absorbing ideas that may, in ways large and small, influence the decisions we make and the world we build. And fourth, and this is the one I keep coming back to, there's something deeply human about the whole phenomenon. Our fascination with Simpsons predictions isn't really about the predictions themselves. It's about our desire to make sense of a chaotic world. We want to believe that someone, somewhere has a handle on what's going to happen next. In the absence of actual prophets, we'll settle for cartoon writers. And honestly, given the track record, there are worse choices. The Simpsons isn't going to predict the end of the world or the name of the next president with any reliability, but it will continue to capture the anxieties and absurdities of its time, and some of those captured moments will continue to rhyme with future events in ways that make us laugh, shake our heads, and wonder if maybe, just maybe, the writers know something we don't. They probably do. They're smarter than most of us. They've been paying attention longer than most of us, and they've been expressing what they see through the most effective communication medium ever invented, which is making people laugh. So the next time something weird happens in the news and someone posts a Simpsons clip that seems to have called it, don't just share it and move on. Think about why the writers made that joke. Think about what they were observing in the world at the time. Think about the trend they were extrapolating and the logic they were following. Because that's where the real magic is. Not in the prediction itself, but in the observation that made the prediction possible. I want to leave you with one last thought before we wind down. There's a version of the Simpsons prediction conversation that's cynical, that says it's all just math and confirmation bias and coincidence, and that there's nothing remarkable about it. And there's another version that's credulous, that says the writers must be time travelers or secret geniuses or members of some Illuminati that knows the future. I think both of those versions miss the point. The truth is somewhere in the middle, and it's more interesting than either extreme. The Simpsons predictions are the product of a unique combination of talent, volume, and cultural attentiveness that has no parallel in entertainment history. They're not supernatural, but they're also not nothing. They're evidence that sustained, intelligent observation of the world can produce insights that feel like prophecy. And in a world that often feels random and chaotic and unpredictable, there's something deeply reassuring about that. It means the world makes sense, even when it doesn't feel like it. The patterns are there. The trends are visible. The future leaves fingerprints. You just have to know where to look. And apparently, one of the best places to look is a cartoon about a bald guy who works at a nuclear power plant and says "dough" a lot, which, if you think about it, might be the most Simpsons prediction of all. That the wisdom of the future would come wrapped in the most unlikely package imaginable. We've been at this for a long time now, and I really appreciate you sticking with me. This topic has been a genuine joy to research and talk about. Every time I thought I'd covered everything, I'd stumble across another prediction that made me do a double take. It's a rabbit hole that just keeps going. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. Seriously, I know this was a marathon, but I hope it was a comfortable one. I hope you learned some things you didn't know. I hope some of these predictions surprised you as much as they surprised me. And I hope that the next time you're scrolling through channels or browsing through a streaming service and you see The Simpsons, you watch it with fresh eyes. Because somewhere in there, buried in a background gag or a throwaway line or a Homer blackboard equation, there might be a clue about what's coming next. We just won't know it until it happens. If you enjoyed this, consider dropping a subscribe or leaving a comment with your favorite Simpsons prediction. I'm always curious which ones hit hardest for different people. Some people are most impressed by the Trump one. Some people love the curling one. Some people can't get over the autocorrect thing. There's no wrong answer. They're all wild. And if there's a Simpsons prediction that I missed tonight, and there almost certainly is because the list grows every year, let me know in the comments. I might do a follow-up at some point if enough new ones accumulate. With this show, it's really just a matter of time. Until next time, sleep well, take care of yourself, and remember, just because a cartoon predicted something doesn't mean the future is written. It just means someone was paying attention. And honestly, in a world that moves as fast as ours does, where every week seems to bring something that nobody saw coming, maybe paying attention is the most valuable skill there is. The Simpsons writers figured that out a long time ago. Maybe the rest of us should take notes. Actually, scratch that. We don't need to take notes. We just need to keep watching The Simpsons. The notes are already there. They've been there for 37 seasons. We just need to wait for the world to catch up. Good night, everyone. Sweet dreams. And if you dream about something that later comes true, well, maybe you've got a future in a writer's room somewhere. See you in the next one. And hey, maybe go watch a Simpsons episode tonight. You might just see tomorrow's headlines before they happen. Stranger things have occurred. 37 seasons of proof say so.